Hey there, night owls. The United States government poisoned its own people, infected them with diseases, and sprayed bacteria over its own cities. This is not a 2 a.m. forum rant your uncle shared. Every fact tonight comes with receipts, court cases, congressional hearings, and declassified files you can dig up yourself. I have got 101 of these, running from the 1700s to stuff that happened practically last Tuesday. The rule is simple. All of it was meant to stay buried forever, and only saw daylight because somebody leaked it, sued over it, or refused to shut up. No theories, no spooky music, just receipts. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where on this planet you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are right now. Now dim the lights, get comfy, and let us get into the stuff they really did not want you to know. Ready? Here we go. Let us begin where the betrayal hits the hardest, which is in the one place you are supposed to be safe. The doctor's office, the clinic, the hospital bed where someone in a white coat leans over you and tells you that everything is going to be fine. For most of us, that is a promise. For a surprising number of Americans across the last century, it was the opening line of an experiment they never agreed to join. Picture a small town in rural Alabama in the early 1930s. The government rolls in offering free healthcare to poor black sharecroppers, men who in most cases had never seen a doctor in their lives. Free medical exams, free meals on examination days, even free burial insurance, which in hindsight was a chilling little detail nobody thought hard enough about at the time. Around 400 of these men had syphilis, and they were told they were being treated for something the doctors called bad blood, a vague catch-all term that could mean anything from anemia to fatigue. What the men were actually enrolled in was a study to observe what untreated syphilis does to the human body over the course of an entire lifetime. The treatment part was never on the menu. Watching them slowly fall apart was the entire point. This program ran from 1932 all the way to 1972, which is 40 years, which is genuinely difficult to process. To put that in perspective, this study outlived World War II, the entire Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the moon landing. It was still quietly humming along while people were watching colour television and listening to disco. And here is the part that turns the stomach. In 1947, penicillin became the standard, reliable, widely available cure for syphilis. A few injections and the disease was effectively beaten. The men in this study were not given any. The researchers actively worked to keep them away from treatment, including making sure they were not drafted into the military during wartime, because a military physical might have accidentally cured them, and that would have ruined the data. When your research design includes the phrase "do not let the army accidentally save these men," you have wandered somewhere very dark indeed. What makes the whole thing land even harder is how personal it was made to feel for the men. A public health nurse was assigned to the study and stayed with it for most of its run, visiting the men over the years, knowing them by name, attending their family gatherings, becoming a trusted and familiar face in the community. To the men she was a friend and a caregiver. To the study she was the human glue that kept them coming back for their checkups, year after year, so the disease could be charted as it ran its course. Whether she fully understood the design she was part of has been debated ever since, but the effect was the same. The men trusted the program precisely because it wore such a friendly face, which is exactly why so few of them ever suspected they were the ones being studied rather than treated. The free meals on exam day, the rides into town, the little gestures of care, all of it functioned to keep the data flowing. When the kindness is a delivery mechanism for the experiment, the kindness is part of the harm. There were also doctors along the way who noticed what was happening and raised the alarm internally, only to be quietly overruled by the institutional momentum of a study that simply did not want to stop. The decision to continue was reviewed and reaffirmed multiple times over the decades by panels of professionals who concluded, with apparently straight faces, that the scientific value of seeing the disease through to the end outweighed the small matter of curing dying men. It took an outside whistleblower handing the story to a journalist to finally do what no internal review ever managed, which was to make it stop. By the time that happened, the human cost was staggering. 28 men had died directly from the disease that a cheap common medicine could have wiped out. Around 100 more died from complications that spiraled out of the untreated infection. Wives were infected, children were born with the disease, and the official scientific justification for all of it was essentially that it would be a shame to waste the data. The study did eventually produce a formal apology from a sitting president, but that came in 1997, which means many of the survivors did not live to hear anyone say sorry. The whole affair became the textbook example, quite literally, that medical students are now taught about so that nothing like it happens again, which is reassuring in the way that a fire extinguisher bolted to the wall is reassuring, comforting, but you would prefer not to need it. Now, if you assume that was a uniquely American problem confined to American soil, I have some unfortunate news. Around the same era, between 1946 and 1948, government researchers ran a sister program in Guatemala that somehow managed to be even worse, mostly because they got tired of waiting for nature to do the infecting. In Alabama, the disease was already present. In Guatemala, the scientists decided to skip that step and infect people on purpose. They deliberately exposed prisoners, mental health patients, and soldiers to syphilis and gonorrhea to test how well penicillin worked as a preventative. Their methods of infection were, to put it gently, creative, and ranged from paying for visits with sex workers who had been deliberately infected to directly applying bacteria to scrapes and other open areas of the body. Nearly 700 people were infected this way. At least 83 of them died. The most disturbing thing about the Guatemala program is not actually the cruelty, as appalling as it was. It is how completely it vanished. Nobody knew. It stayed buried in dusty archives for over 60 years, until a historian stumbled across the records of the lead researcher while studying something else entirely. The program only became public knowledge in 2010, which triggered an official apology to Guatemala from the United States. 60 years is a long time for several hundred deliberate infections to stay tucked quietly in a filing cabinet, and it raises the slightly uncomfortable question of what else is still sitting in those cabinets, waiting for the right curious historian to come along. If deliberate infection feels like the floor, let me introduce you to the radioactive basement underneath it. Because while some researchers were busy with bacteria, others had discovered something shiny and new and absolutely terrifying, and they were itching to point it at the general public. At a university hospital in Tennessee in the mid-1940s, researchers were curious about how the body absorbs iron during pregnancy. A reasonable enough question. Their method of answering it was to hand hundreds of pregnant women a drink they were told was a nutritional cocktail, a little something to keep mother and baby healthy. It was described to them more or less as a vitamin. What it actually contained was radioactive iron, served up so the scientists could track how it moved through the body and into the developing baby. The women drank it trusting their doctors, because why on earth would you not? Years later, several of the children born from those pregnancies developed unusually rare cancers, and the women themselves had never been told what was really in the glass. When the only honest label for your prenatal vitamin would have been mildly radioactive, you have crossed a line that no amount of scientific curiosity gets to excuse, and the radioactive theme, unfortunately, was just warming up. In the years right after World War II, as the country raced to understand the new atomic age, a handful of researchers wanted to know exactly what plutonium does inside a living human being. Plutonium, for the record, is one of the most toxic substances ever produced by people, the kind of thing handled today behind thick glass with remote robotic arms by technicians who would rather be anywhere else. The researchers needed human test subjects, and they were not in the habit of asking. 18 patients at various hospitals were injected with plutonium between 1945 and 1947, with no idea what was happening to them. One of the very first was a man admitted to a hospital after a car accident, who came in with a broken arm and several other injuries, and was, on paper, simply a patient who needed setting and stitching. Instead of being treated and sent home, he was selected, injected with plutonium, and studied. Doctors pulled samples, monitored his body, and at one point even removed some of his teeth and a bit of bone to measure how much of the material had settled into him, all without ever telling him why. He had walked in expecting a cast and walked out as an unwilling data point in a study about how a nuclear material poisons a person from the inside. The full scope of these plutonium experiments did not surface for decades, and when it finally did, it prompted a formal government investigation that confirmed the grim details. The patients had been chosen partly because doctors believed they were unlikely to survive long enough to ask awkward questions, which is a logic so cold it practically frosts the window. And the plutonium injections, as horrifying as they were, turned out to be just one small drawer in an enormous filing cabinet. When the full picture of Cold War radiation research was finally pried open by a sustained government investigation in the 1990s, it became clear that there had not been a handful of rogue experiments, but thousands of them, spread across universities, hospitals, and military facilities over several decades. People had been fed radioactive material, injected with it, exposed to it, and irradiated, often without meaningful consent and frequently without ever being told. The records were scattered, incomplete, and in many cases deliberately vague, full of soothing bureaucratic language designed to make a study about poisoning people read like a routine nutritional survey. The investigators eventually concluded that a shocking number of these experiments had offered the subjects no benefit whatsoever, and had been conducted purely to gather data, with the risks quietly absorbed by whoever happened to be lying in the bed that day. The sheer volume of it is the part that stays with you. This was not a conspiracy of a few bad doctors in a back room. It was a widespread, normalized way of doing business, and almost everyone involved seems to have considered it perfectly reasonable at the time. Children, sadly, were not off limits either, and here the cover stories got almost insultingly cozy. At a state institution for children with intellectual disabilities in New York, researchers spent the better part of 2 decades, roughly 1956 through 1970, deliberately infecting young residents with hepatitis to study how the disease progressed and how a possible vaccine might work. The conditions inside the institution were already grim and overcrowded enough that hepatitis spread easily on its own, and the researchers essentially decided that since the kids were probably going to catch it anyway, they might as well control the timing and dosage for science. In some cases, they fed children extract made from the feces of infected patients to ensure the disease took hold. Parents who wanted their child admitted to the badly overcrowded facility were sometimes told that the fastest way to get a spot was to enroll their child in the Special Research Unit, which is a sentence that should never have existed. Consent obtained by dangling a scarce hospital bed in front of a desperate family is not really consent. It is leverage wearing a lab coat. Around the same period, in a hospital in Ohio, the radiation came back for an encore, this time aimed at cancer patients who were mostly poor and disproportionately black. A physician there ran a program from 1960 to 1972 in which terminally and seriously ill cancer patients were blasted with enormous doses of full-body radiation. The patients were told it was a treatment for their cancer. The catch is that for many of their cancer types, this kind of total body radiation was not an accepted or effective therapy, and the doctors knew it. The real purpose, funded under a contract with the Defense Department, was to study how radiation affects the human body in combat readiness, essentially gathering data on what a soldier might experience after a nuclear blast. The patients became stand-ins for hypothetical troops on a hypothetical irradiated battlefield. Many of them suffered horribly in their final weeks, vomiting and bleeding from the radiation rather than from their disease, and a number of them died sooner than they otherwise would have. They thought they were fighting their cancer. They were actually being measured. Not every violation in this era involved a needle or a beam, though. Some involved nothing more than a routine sample, taken and kept and used forever, without anyone ever asking. In 1951, a young woman went to a hospital in Baltimore for treatment of an aggressive cancer. During her care, doctors took a sample of her tumour cells without telling her, which was sadly standard practice at the time. What made her sample extraordinary was that her cells, unlike essentially every other human cell sample anyone had ever tried to grow in a lab, simply refused to die. They kept dividing and multiplying indefinitely, the first human cells ever to do so in culture, which made them a goldmine for research. Those cells went on to become one of the most important tools in the history of medicine. They were used to develop the polio vaccine, to study cancer, to test the effects of radiation and toxins, to advance gene mapping, and they have been launched into space and used in tens of thousands of scientific studies. Companies built entire industries on them and made considerable money. The woman they came from died of her cancer that same year, at the age of 31, never knowing that a piece of her would effectively go on to outlive everyone she had ever met. Her family had no idea any of this had happened for more than 20 years, and they did not see a cent of the profit, even as her cells were bought and sold in laboratories all over the planet. It is one of the strangest and saddest legacies in science. A woman who has saved countless lives and remains, in a very real biological sense, still working, while her own family spent decades unable to afford the very healthcare her cells helped make possible. If you are sensing a theme by now, you're not imagining it. The pattern keeps repeating with grim consistency. Find people who are poor, sick, imprisoned, institutionalized, or otherwise unlikely to push back, and use their bodies to answer a question they were never asked. At a school for boys in Massachusetts, researchers fed children radioactive material hidden in their breakfast. The boys, many of them in the care of the state, were enrolled in what was cheerfully presented to them as a science club. Membership in the science club came with special privileges, extra attention, even trips to baseball games, all the things a lonely institutionalized kid would jump at. The actual price of membership was eating breakfast cereal and milk that had been dosed with radioactive tracers, so a cereal company and its research partners could study how the body absorbs minerals. The doses were individually small, but the consent was non-existent. The subjects were children, and the cheerful science club framing makes the whole thing feel less like research and more like a con. And then there were the prisons, which by the middle of the 20th century had quietly become some of the busiest human testing grounds in the country. At correctional facilities across several states, incarcerated men were used as test subjects for a dizzying array of experiments, often in exchange for small amounts of money or the vague hope that participation might look good to a parole board. At one prison in Illinois, inmates were deliberately infected with malaria to test anti-malarial drugs, a program that ran for decades and was even, somewhat awkwardly, held up as a model of ethical prison research at the time. At a prison in Pennsylvania, a dermatologist turned the inmate population into what he reportedly described as a fertile field, testing everything from cosmetics and shampoos to skin-blistering chemical agents and experimental drugs directly on the skin of the men inside. He famously remarked that when he first saw all those rows of available test subjects, all he could see was acres of skin. The men were paid pennies, were often not told what they were being exposed to, and some carried scars and health problems for the rest of their lives. The arrangement only ended when reforms in the 70s finally made it much harder to treat a prison population like a stockroom of spare skin. So that is the indoor portion of our tour, the experiments that happened behind hospital doors and prison walls and institutional gates, where at least the cruelty had the decency to stay in one building. Which brings us to the obvious next question. What happens when researchers decide that a single building is too small and that the real test subject they want is an entire city full of people who have absolutely no idea they have just been enrolled? Because it turns out that if you want to know how a biological weapon would spread through a major metropolitan area, you do not necessarily need an enemy to attack you. You can, if you are sufficiently committed and worryingly unbothered by ethics, simply attack yourself and take notes. And that is more or less the story of how the United States military came to spend a not insignificant chunk of the Cold War using its own citizens as the unwitting backdrop for open-air biological tests. The reasoning behind it was not even particularly secret in spirit. Military planners were genuinely worried, and not unreasonably, that an enemy might one day try to attack American cities with germs or chemicals. The trouble is the conclusion they drew from that worry. Rather than model the threat with sensors and simulations, they decided the only truly realistic way to learn how an attack would unfold was to stage a dress rehearsal over a real population, complete with real wind, real buildings, and real lungs. The cities were never told they had been cast in the rehearsal. As long as the test material was officially classified as harmless, the planners apparently felt no obligation to mention it, which set up a pattern you will see again and again. Declare something safe, spray it on people who never agreed to it, and then point to the safety label if anyone complains. The fact that the safety label was frequently more of an educated guess than a proven fact was, conveniently, somebody else's problem. Let us start in San Francisco in September of 1950. For 6 straight days, a Navy ship sat off the coast and sprayed an enormous cloud of bacteria toward the city, letting the fog and the ocean breeze carry it inland over hundreds of thousands of sleeping residents. The bacteria chosen was a microbe that was believed at the time to be harmless, and that had the convenient property of turning a distinctive reddish colour when it grew, which made it easy to track. The idea was to find out how a real biological attack might disperse across a large coastal city, with all its hills and wind patterns and dense neighbourhoods. San Francisco was, essentially, a giant petri dish that happened to contain people, and the people were not consulted. Shortly after the spraying, something strange happened at local hospitals. Doctors began seeing a cluster of unusual infections, including a type of pneumonia that was rare enough that one hospital wrote up the sudden spike in a medical journal, genuinely baffled about where it had come from. At least one man, an older patient recovering from a routine procedure, developed a severe infection from that very bacterium and died. His family spent decades convinced something was off, and only much later, when the test was finally declassified, did the pieces fit together. The military's position was that the bacterium was generally harmless to healthy people, which conveniently sidesteps the fact that a city is not made up exclusively of healthy people. A city is also full of newborns, the elderly, people recovering from surgery, and people with weakened immune systems, none of whom were given the option to step out of the cloud. The supposedly harmless test microbe is now recognized as something that genuinely can cause infections in vulnerable people, which is the kind of detail that would have been useful to confirm before, rather than after, blanketing a major city in it. San Francisco was not a one-off experiment either. It was more like a proof of concept that the program liked enough to repeat in a variety of creative venues. In 1966, researchers turned their attention to the New York City subway system, which, if you have ever ridden it, you will agree is already an unpredictable enough environment without anyone adding deliberate bacteria to the mix. Agents dropped light bulbs filled with bacteria onto the tracks as trains pulled into stations, letting the rushing air from the moving trains, the famous gust that blows your hair back on the platform, pull the microbes through the tunnels and into the cars. They then travelled around with sampling equipment to measure how far and how fast the bacteria spread. The conclusion was that it spread extremely well, carried for miles through the tunnels, and that well over 1 million commuters were potentially exposed to it on their ordinary morning trip to work. The passengers naturally had no idea that the slight breeze and the faint smell of the subway that day came with a complementary biological payload. What is almost comic, in the bleakest possible way, is the level of casual nerve it took to pull this off in broad daylight. Agents in ordinary clothes simply stood on crowded platforms during rush hour, dropped their bacteria-filled bulbs as if they had clumsily shattered a light bulb by accident, mumbled an apology to anyone nearby, and walked off to take their measurements. Thousands of commuters watched a man drop something on the tracks and thought nothing more of it, because in a busy subway station something is always being dropped, spilled, or broken. The genius and the horror of the whole operation was how completely it blended into the everyday chaos of city life. Nobody suspects the laboratory, when the laboratory looks exactly like a Tuesday morning commute. If bacteria were the appetizer, the main course was a fine powder called zinc cadmium sulfide, which the military sprayed over dozens upon dozens of American cities and towns to study how airborne particles drift and settle. It glows under ultraviolet light, which made it a handy stand-in for tracking how a chemical or biological agent might travel on the wind. Over the course of the program, this material was released over more than 200 locations across the country, blanketing places like Minneapolis and many others, while residents went about their business below. People reported the powder settling on their cars and windowsills and simply assumed it was ordinary dust or pollen, because what else would you assume? Nobody hands out a flyer warning that the strange film on your porch is part of a classified dispersal test. The most troubling chapter of the powder program unfolded in St. Louis, where the military sprayed the material repeatedly, in some neighborhoods as many as 1,000 or more separate times over the years. What makes St. Louis stand out is where the spraying was concentrated. The releases were aimed disproportionately at low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods, with sprayers mounted on rooftops and even on the backs of vehicles that would drive through the area releasing clouds of the stuff. Residents were told, in the rare cases they were told anything, that the military was testing a smokescreen to protect the city from aerial observation, a cover story that was, shall we say, generously fictional. People who grew up in those neighborhoods and later developed unusual rates of certain cancers have spent years asking whether there was a connection, and while the military long insisted the powder was harmless, the simple fact that nobody was asked, warned, or monitored afterward means those questions can never be fully and fairly answered. The honest scientific position on whether it was safe is that nobody bothered to collect the data that would have let them know, which is a remarkable thing to discover about a decades-long program built entirely around collecting data. The open-air experiments were not limited to dry land either. A sprawling program that ran from the early 60s into the early 70s took the whole concept out to sea. The military exposed its own sailors, around 6,000 of them across many separate trials, to a menu of genuinely nightmarish substances to test how ships and crews would hold up under chemical and biological attack. We are talking about nerve agents among the deadliest poisons ever synthesized, the kind where a microscopic droplet on the skin can be fatal, alongside various live biological agents. Ships would sail through clouds of these substances, while the crews, in many cases, had no real idea what they were being exposed to and little or no protection. The sailors thought they were participating in ordinary readiness drills. They were participating in a study of how effectively a chemical weapon could incapacitate the men aboard a warship, with the men themselves serving as the readout. Some of the trials involved spraying agents directly over the decks while the crew worked. Others piped substances through the ship's ventilation to see how far they would travel into the living quarters, and a few involved sailors in small boats positioned downwind specifically to be caught in the drifting cloud. The men were sometimes given protective gear and sometimes not, depending on what the test was trying to measure, which means in certain trials the absence of protection was not an oversight, but the entire point. Many of these veterans spent the following decades fighting unexplained illnesses and just as importantly fighting to get the government to even admit the test had happened, because the program was classified for so long that the men could not get medical care for exposures the government would not confirm. Imagine going to a doctor with a strange chronic illness, knowing exactly what caused it, and being unable to even name the cause because naming it was technically still a state secret. That was the position thousands of these men were left in for the better part of their lives. If you're wondering how a program this enormous, spraying nerve agents and bacteria across cities, subways and oceans finally cracked open into public view, the answer is wonderfully and tragically on brand. It was not a brave official deciding to come clean, it was sheep. In March of 1968, at a vast and secretive testing range out in the Utah desert, the military was conducting open-air trials of a nerve agent, one of the most lethal ever created, a single drop of which can kill. Something went wrong, as things tend to do when you are aerosolizing one of the deadliest substances on Earth in the open air. A quantity of the agent drifted off the range on the wind, far further than anyone intended, and rolled across the surrounding valleys. The result was the sudden and mysterious death of roughly 6,000 sheep grazing in the area, who began stumbling, collapsing and dying in disturbing numbers across the desert. Ranchers were horrified, the public demanded answers, and the military initially did what large secretive institutions reflexively do, which is to deny everything and suggest it must have been something else entirely, perhaps pesticides, perhaps a coincidence, perhaps the sheep had simply decided as one to give up on life. But 6,000 dead animals downwind of a nerve agent test is a difficult thing to explain away, and the incident forced a reluctant partial acknowledgement of just how much deadly material the program had been releasing into the open air. The grim irony is hard to miss. The thing that finally pried open the lid on years of secret tests, many of which exposed actual human beings, was the death of a flock of sheep, who at least, unlike the residents of San Francisco and St. Louis, and the subway riders of New York, got an investigation named after them. And that is really the thread tying this entire stretch of history together. Whether the setting was a clinic, a prison, an institution for children, a cancer ward, a coastal city, a subway tunnel, or a warship steaming through a poison cloud, the common ingredient was never the disease, or the chemical, or the radiation. It was the missing permission. In every single one of these cases, the one thing that would have made the difference between research and a crime was a simple, honest conversation, a moment where someone in authority said, "Here is what we want to do, here is the risk, and you are free to say no." That conversation almost never happened. The people in charge calculated again and again that it was easier and more efficient to skip the part where the human beings involved got a vote. The data they gathered was real. The discoveries were sometimes genuinely useful, but the cost was paid entirely by people who never agreed to pay it, and who in most cases died without ever learning they had been billed. So far, every violation we have looked at aimed at the body, the blood, the lungs, the bones, the cells. But there was one agency that decided the body was frankly too obvious a target, and that the real prize, the truly valuable territory worth conquering, was the mind itself. If you could control what a person thought, believed, remembered, and confessed, then you would never again need to bother with anything as crude as a needle. You could simply rewrite the operator from the inside. That was the dream, and chasing it became one of the strangest and most reckless programs in the entire history of the intelligence world. It officially launched in 1953 and ran for about 20 years, and its goal was nothing less than figuring out how to take over a human mind. This was peak Cold War paranoia, the era when officials had convinced themselves that rival powers had cracked the secret of brainwashing, that captured soldiers were being returned home as walking puppets, and that the side which mastered mind control first would win everything. So the agency set out to catch up, and the centerpiece of its research was a substance that had only recently arrived on the scene and that nobody fully understood: lysergic acid, better known by its initials as LSD. The agency became, for a stretch of the 50s, possibly the single largest purchaser and distributor of the drug on the planet, which is a sentence that should give you pause, given that this was an organization devoted to secrecy and control, experimenting heavily with a chemical whose defining feature is that it dissolves both. The plan was to give the drug to people and observe what happened. The trouble was finding people, and the agency was not especially interested in volunteers who knew what they were signing up for, because a subject who knows they have taken a powerful hallucinogen is, naturally, a contaminated experiment. They wanted to see how the drug worked on someone who had no idea, who would experience the full disorienting force of it, with no warning and no framework to make sense of it. So they dosed people without telling them. Thousands of people over the years across dozens of institutions: prisoners, hospital patients, people seeking psychiatric help, employees of the agency itself, and in some of the most cynical cases, complete strangers who had simply walked into the wrong establishment at the wrong time. The subjects ranged from the institutionalized to the unsuspecting, and the one thing they nearly all had in common was that nobody asked them first, which by now you will recognize as the recurring signature of this entire story. The structure of the program was as sprawling as its ambitions. It was not a single experiment but an umbrella sheltering well over 100 separate sub-projects, farmed out to universities, hospitals, prisons, and private laboratories all across the country. To keep the agency's fingerprints off the work, much of the money flowed through front organizations, charitable-sounding foundations that existed mainly to launder research grants, so that a respectable professor accepting funds had no idea, or chose to have no idea, where the money truly came from. This meant that some of the most reputable institutions in the country were quietly hosting pieces of a mind control program, without the public, the patients, or in some cases even the researchers fully grasping what the larger puzzle looked like. The genius of the arrangement was its deniability. No single scientist could see the whole picture. The funding trail vanished into a maze of innocent-looking foundations, and the agency could honestly tell each researcher that they were simply pursuing interesting science. Spread the work thinly enough across enough respectable hands, and a program devoted to breaking the human mind starts to look like ordinary academic research. The most theatrical and frankly unhinged branch of this effort took the experiment out of the lab entirely, reasoning that the most realistic way to study how the drug affected ordinary people in ordinary circumstances was to do exactly that. The agency rented apartments and quietly turned them into observation posts. In San Francisco and New York, they set up these private establishments and staffed them with women who would lure unsuspecting men inside. Once a man was settled in, comfortable, and offered a drink, the drink would arrive spiked with a hefty dose of LSD. The man would then, over the next few hours, slide into a confused and hallucinatory state, while an agent sat hidden behind a one-way mirror, sipping a beverage, taking notes, and observing the entire scene unfold like the world's most disturbing nature documentary. The agent who ran much of this operation was a colourful character who reportedly kept a pitcher of cocktails in the observation room and treated the whole assignment as the dream posting it apparently was. He's said to have later written that the work let him do things in service of his country that in any other context would have landed him in serious trouble, and that few jobs let a man lie, cheat, steal, and watch beautiful people while being praised for it. That cheerful confession captures the spirit of the program with uncomfortable precision. The targets were chosen specifically because they were unlikely to complain to the authorities, since admitting where they had been and why was its own kind of risk. It was the perfect crime built on the perfect silence, conducted by an agency that had correctly calculated that its victims would be too embarrassed to ever speak up. The drug experiments were only one front, though. The same broad program funded research into hypnosis, into sensory deprivation, into electroshock, and into combinations of drugs and isolation designed to break a person down and see whether the pieces could then be reassembled into something more useful. The genuinely chilling ambition underneath all of it was the idea of building a person who could be programmed, an individual who might be made to carry out an act, even a violent one, and then have the memory of it wiped clean, leaving behind someone with no knowledge of what they had done. This is the stuff of spy thrillers, except the people pursuing it were not novelists. They were salaried researchers with real budgets and real subjects, soberly investigating whether you could turn a human being into a remote-controlled tool. As far as the surviving evidence shows, they never actually succeeded, which is reassuring, though the fact that serious people spent serious years and serious money sincerely trying is considerably less so. A good deal of the effort was also aimed at the slightly more grounded goal of interrogation. The agency badly wanted a reliable truth serum, some chemical key that would unlock a captured agent's secrets and make lying impossible, and a great deal of the drug testing was really a long, frustrating search for that fantasy substance. They worked through an entire pharmacy of candidates, hoping one would loosen tongues without scrambling the brain so badly that the answers became useless. The results were consistently disappointing in the most predictable way. The drugs that made people talk also made them babble, hallucinate, and confidently report things that were not remotely true, which is a fundamental problem with the whole concept of a truth serum. A mind dissolved enough to surrender its secrets is also a mind dissolved enough to invent them. They were essentially trying to build a lie detector out of the one tool guaranteed to produce the most creative lies, and the longer they pursued it, the more elaborate and reckless the experiments became. One of the darkest chapters within this research happened at a hospital in Canada, where a respected and influential psychiatrist received funding to pursue his own theories about reshaping the human mind. His method was to take patients who had come to him with ordinary problems like anxiety and depression and subject them to a brutal regimen he believed would erase their existing personality, so a healthier one could be built in its place. Patients were kept in drug-induced sleep for weeks at a stretch, subjected to repeated electroshock at intensities far beyond the norm, and forced to listen to recorded messages played on a loop for days on end, sometimes hundreds of thousands of repetitions in the belief that this would reprogram their thinking. The result was not a parade of healthier minds. Many of the patients emerged permanently damaged, having lost memories, skills, and in some cases the basic ability to function, walking into a clinic with treatable troubles and walking out as shells of who they had been. They had gone looking for help and instead become raw material for a theory. Running parallel to all of this, the military was conducting its own enormous program at an arsenal on the East Coast, where for roughly 2 decades, from the mid-50s into the mid-70s, soldiers were used to test the effects of a long list of chemical agents. More than 7,000 servicemen passed through. They were exposed to hallucinogens, to incapacitating agents that produced confusion and bizarre behavior, and to genuine chemical weapons including nerve agents and blistering agents. The soldiers were told, in the broadest possible terms, that they were helping to test new protective equipment, and that the work was important and safe. What they were actually doing was serving as living gauges for how various poisons affect human performance, perception, and survival. Some were given drugs that left them hallucinating for days. Some were exposed to agents that blistered their skin. And like the sailors caught in the sea trials, many of these men spent the following decades struggling with health problems they could not fully explain and could not get formally acknowledged because the records were sealed and the program was officially something that had never quite happened. One category of agent tested there deserves a special mention for sheer strangeness. The researchers were fascinated by a class of incapacitating compounds designed not to kill an enemy, but to render an entire unit useless through confusion, with soldiers who were dosed reportedly becoming disoriented, talking to people who were not there, and behaving in ways that range from comical to genuinely alarming for days at a time. The military theory was that you could win a battle without firing a shot simply by turning the opposing force into a field full of bewildered men chasing imaginary butterflies. To work out the dose, they of course needed to confuse their own soldiers first, and so young volunteers were turned loose under the influence of these compounds, while observers noted how long it took them to lose track of reality and how long it took to find it again. The men had been told they were testing equipment for the safety of the troops, which was technically true in the same way that telling someone you are testing the brakes does not quite cover the part where you intend to drive them off a cliff. But the single most haunting story to emerge from the entire mind control effort belongs to one man, a respected biochemist who worked for the army on biological research and who had every reason to trust the people around him. In the autumn of 1953, he attended a work retreat where, at one point, his colleagues offered him a drink. What he did not know was that the drink had been secretly dosed with LSD as part of an experiment to study the effect on an unsuspecting member of their own circle. He had no idea he had been drugged. Over the following days he became deeply distressed, anxious, and unlike himself and his colleagues, recognizing they had a problem on their hands, brought him to New York supposedly to see a doctor. In the early hours of one morning, he went out the window of a hotel room on a high floor and fell to his death on the street below. The official account was that it was a tragic suicide brought on by a man having a breakdown. For more than 20 years, his family believed exactly that, until the broader program came to light and they learned, to their horror, that he had been secretly drugged shortly before his death. The agency quietly settled with the family and even arranged an apology from the highest levels of government. But the story did not end there. Decades later, the family had his body exhumed and independently examined, and the forensic findings did not match a simple fall. There was evidence consistent with a blow to the head before he went out the window, which is, to put it mildly, not what you expect to find on a man who jumped. The case has never been resolved. The truth has never been fully established, and it sits there as one of the great unanswered questions of the whole era. A single window in a single hotel that has never stopped raising doubts. And here is the part that ensures we will never get the full picture of any of it. In 1973, with investigations beginning to circle and the political winds shifting, the director of the agency at the time gave an order to destroy the program's files, and destroyed they largely were. The overwhelming majority of the records, by most estimates around 90%, were shredded and burned before anyone outside the program could read them. What we know today survives almost entirely because of a bureaucratic accident. A batch of financial records had been misfiled in the wrong storage location, and so escaped the purge, and it was those dry budget documents of all things that investigators later stumbled upon, allowing the program to be reconstructed in fragments. So everything we understand about one of the most ambitious attempts to control the human mind ever attempted, we understand because somebody filed the expense reports in the wrong drawer. The full scope of what was tried, and on how many people, burned up in 1973 and is gone for good. We are essentially reading the footnotes of a book whose main text was deliberately turned to ash. If the agency was trying to conquer the inner world of the mind, there was another arm of the government busy testing the outer limits of physical destruction, and it was no more careful with the people standing nearby. Because while some were chasing the secrets of thought, others had built the most powerful weapon in human history, and were setting it off, again and again, in the open air, upwind of their own citizens. Across the deserts of the American West, from the late 40s into the early 60s, the country detonated more than 100 nuclear devices above ground. These were not small. Each blast lofted an enormous cloud of radioactive material high into the atmosphere, and that material did not politely stay over the empty test range. It drifted on the wind and rained down across the countryside, settling onto farms, towns, pastures, water supplies, and the people of the surrounding states, particularly the communities downwind in places like Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. These communities, the people who came to be known simply as the downwinders, were repeatedly assured there was nothing to worry about, that the fallout was harmless, and that they should go about their lives. Some were even encouraged to step outside and watch the spectacular flashes on the horizon, treating a nuclear detonation as a sort of free fireworks show, which is a level of official reassurance that has aged about as well as you would expect. In reality, the fallout settled on the grass that cows ate, which concentrated it in the milk that children drank, delivering radioactive material straight to the most vulnerable bodies in the most efficient way imaginable. In the years that followed, those communities saw elevated rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, and other illnesses that clustered in ways no amount of official reassurance could explain. Families buried children. Entire small towns developed a quiet familiarity with diseases they had no business seeing so often, and the government, which had detailed knowledge of where the fallout was going and what it could do, chose secrecy and denial over warning the people in its path, because admitting the danger would have meant slowing down the program. It took until 1990, decades after the last above-ground test, for a law to finally acknowledge the harm and offer compensation to some of the people affected, by which time a great many of them were no longer alive to file a claim. The reach of the fallout was wide enough to touch people who were only passing through. In the mid-50s, a film production set up shop in a desert region, downwind of the test site to shoot an epic adventure, hauling in a large cast and crew, and even trucking in dirt from the contaminated area to use on a soundstage back home for the sake of matching the scenery. In the decades that followed, an unusually large share of the people who had worked on that production developed cancer, far more than statistics would predict for a group that size, including several of its most famous names. No one can prove with certainty that the desert dust was the cause, since people get sick for all kinds of reasons, but a cluster that's severe among people who spent weeks breathing the air of a fallout zone is the sort of coincidence that makes statisticians distinctly uncomfortable. It is a strange and almost cinematic footnote to the whole affair, a movie about conquest undone, perhaps, by the very ground it was filmed on. The disregard for the very young reached an especially eerie extreme in a quiet research effort to measure exactly how far the fallout had spread into human bodies. The element of greatest concern was a radioactive form of strontium that behaves chemically like calcium, which means the body, fooled by the resemblance, deposits it into growing bones. To find out how much of it was ending up in people, particularly in children whose bones were still forming, researchers needed bone samples from the young, and they needed a lot of them. So they quietly gathered the bones of dead infants and children from around the world, in many cases without the knowledge or consent of the grieving families. Over 1,000 samples were collected from various countries, taken from babies who had died of unrelated causes, all to chart the global reach of the radioactive material. The families burying their children had no idea that their loss was being measured for data, and the program stayed hidden for decades. There is something uniquely cold about a research effort that treats the bones of dead babies as a convenient measuring instrument, harvested in silence and tallied on a chart. The nuclear era also produced a more darkly comic genre of problem, which is the matter of the bombs the military simply lost and never managed to find again. Over the years, through accidents, mid-air collisions and crashes, a number of live nuclear weapons fell out of the sky or off of aircraft and were never recovered. Off the coast of Georgia, a bomb was jettisoned into the shallow waters near an island after a mid-air collision, and despite searches, it has never been located, which means it is presumably still down there in the silt, quietly being someone else's problem. In Spain, an accident scattered weapons across the countryside and into the sea, with one of them lost in the water for months and requiring a frantic recovery effort, while broken material contaminated farmland that needed extensive cleanup. Off the coast of Greenland, a bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed onto the sea ice, and despite a major recovery operation, components were reportedly never fully accounted for. The reassuring official line is that these lost weapons pose little danger where they sit. The slightly less reassuring reality is that there are functioning nuclear weapons scattered in places nobody can quite put their finger on, and the standard plan for several of them appears to be hoping very hard that they stay lost. These were not the only close calls either. The broader record of the era is dotted with accidents that came alarmingly near to detonating a weapon on home soil entirely by mistake. On more than one occasion, a bomber carrying live weapons crashed or broke apart in flight, sending its payload tumbling toward the ground, and in at least one well-documented case, a device that fell on a southern state went through several of the steps in its arming sequence on the way down, with only a single ordinary switch reportedly standing between a routine flight accident and the accidental nuclear destruction of an American region. The official position for years was that such a thing could never happen, that the safeguards were foolproof, right up until the declassified documents revealed just how close the foolproof safeguards had come to being overruled by a stuck switch and gravity. It is a sobering thought that some of the most consequential moments in the country's history may have been near misses that the public was never told about, decided not by strategy or diplomacy, but by which way a small piece of metal happened to flip on its way to the dirt. While the bombs were being lost and the fallout was drifting, the military was also deliberately marching its own troops straight toward the explosions. During a series of exercises in the desert, soldiers were positioned remarkably close to nuclear detonations and then ordered to advance toward ground zero in the immediate aftermath, the idea being to train them and to study how men and equipment would perform on a nuclear battlefield. Roughly 400,000 servicemen took part in these atomic maneuvers over the years. They crouched in trenches as the bombs went off, felt the heat and the shock wave, watched the flash through their own bones as the light passed through their hands, and then got up and walked toward the still glowing crater. They were given little protection and even less honest information about the risk, and many of them, naturally, went on to develop cancers and other illnesses at elevated rates. These men became known as the atomic soldiers, and for decades they were under strict secrecy orders that forbade them from even discussing what they had witnessed, which made getting medical care or recognition for radiation exposure all but impossible. It is hard to file a claim about an event you are legally not allowed to admit you attended. The secrecy was enforced with a thoroughness that bordered on the surreal. Men returned from these exercises having seen one of the most extraordinary and terrible things a human can witness, and were then told, in no uncertain terms, that they were never to speak of it to anyone, not their wives, not their doctors, not their own children, sometimes under threat of severe penalties. Some carried that silence for the rest of their lives, decades of holding the single most significant memory they possessed entirely alone, unable even to explain to a physician why their health had taken the turn it had. The footage that exists of these tests, much of it filmed by the military itself for study, was classified for years, and when some of it finally surfaced, it showed lines of ordinary men in fatigues, crouched in the open desert, while a fireball climbed the sky behind them. Watching it now, the most striking thing is how casual it all looks. Like an ordinary training day that happens to feature the most destructive force ever harnessed going off a short walk away. The men wave at the camera, some of them grin. None of them appear to have been told that the light passing through their hands was the kind of thing that would be measured in their bones for the rest of their lives. The largest single detonation the country ever set off provided perhaps the clearest example of how badly these things could go, and how readily the resulting suffering could be repurposed into research. In the spring of 1954, on a remote Pacific atoll, the military tested a thermonuclear device that turned out to be far more powerful than the scientists had predicted, more than double the expected yield. The blast was so much larger than anticipated that its fallout zone extended well beyond the area that had been evacuated, raining radioactive ash down on inhabited islands and on the crew of a fishing boat that happened to be in the wrong stretch of ocean. The residents of a nearby atoll who had not been moved watched the white ash fall like snow, with children reportedly playing in it, unaware it was lethal. They soon developed burns, sickness, and long-term health problems, including thyroid disease and cancers in the years that followed. What turned this tragedy into something worse was the response. Rather than treating the exposed islanders purely as victims to be cared for and compensated, the program quietly folded them into a study, monitoring their health for years to learn what long-term radiation exposure does to a human population. The affected community became, in effect, a natural experiment that the program was determined not to waste, observed and measured over the long term, while the underlying cause of their suffering remained classified. The fishermen on the boat suffered too, with one of the crew dying, and the incident caused an international uproar precisely because the human cost was too visible to hide. It stands as a grim summary of the whole nuclear approach to people, where an accident becomes a dataset and the injured become subjects. The treatment of the displaced islanders only deepened over time. After a few years away from their contaminated home, they were eventually returned to their atoll and told it was safe to resume their lives, despite lingering radiation in the soil and in the local food. Predictably and tragically, the contamination had not simply vanished, and rates of illness and birth complications among them remained elevated for years, prompting yet another relocation later on. Throughout, the community served less as patients to be healed, and more as a long-running observation, their bodies quietly tracking the lingering effects of radiation across an entire generation. To be sent home as a test of whether home was survivable yet, and to have the answer turn out to be not really, is about as bleak an arrangement as can be imagined, and it was carried out by people who filed careful reports about it. Not every nuclear secret of the era was about explosions, though. Some were about ambition so vast it bordered on the absurd. Deep beneath the ice sheet of Greenland, the military constructed a sprawling base, a genuine subterranean city carved into the ice, complete with living quarters, a hospital, a chapel, and even its own portable nuclear reactor to power the whole thing. It was publicly presented as a scientific research station studying the polar environment, which was partly true, in the way that a cover story is always partly true. The real and secret purpose was a scheme to carve a vast network of tunnels under the ice and use them to hide and move nuclear missiles around, creating a mobile launch system that an adversary would never be able to target. There was, it turned out, one fairly significant flaw in the plan that the engineers had not fully appreciated. Ice moves. The glacier was slowly but relentlessly flowing and deforming, and within just a few years the tunnels were buckling and closing in on themselves, crushing the dream of an under-ice missile fortress. The base was abandoned, the grand scheme quietly shelved, and the whole episode left behind a reactor's worth of waste entombed in a glacier that everyone assumed would keep it frozen forever, which is a comforting assumption only if you do not think too hard about what ice does over the long term. The nuclear story does not end with the Cold War either, because the materials it produced have a way of lingering far longer than the conflicts they were made for. In more recent decades, munitions made with a dense radioactive metal left over from the nuclear fuel process were used in combat in the Middle East, valued because the metal is heavy enough to punch through armor. When these rounds strike and burn, they scatter fine radioactive and toxic dust across the battlefield, dust that settles into the soil, the water, and the air of the places where people continue to live long after the fighting stops. In certain heavily bombarded cities, doctors and researchers have reported troubling increases in birth defects, cancers, and other illnesses in the years since, raising hard questions about the long-term cost of leaving that kind of material scattered across populated areas. The most sobering detail of all is one of simple chemistry. The primary form of this material has a half-life measured not in years or centuries, but in billions of years, longer than the entire age of the planet so far. Whatever was scattered in those cities will, for all practical purposes, still be there long after every nation currently arguing about it has turned to dust. We tend to think of the consequences of these decisions as something that fades with time, a wound that eventually heals. With this particular material, the arithmetic is brutally clear. It does not fade. It simply waits, and it will go on waiting longer than anyone alive can meaningfully imagine. Every empire that ever existed, every language ever spoken, the entire span of recorded human history, all of it is a rounding error next to the patience of that dust. Long after the wars are forgotten, and the reasons they were fought have crumbled into footnotes, the material will still be sitting in that soil, exactly as radioactive as the day it landed, quietly outlasting the very species that made it. Up to now, the damage has been physical. Poisoned blood, scrambled minds, irradiated bones. But there is a quieter kind of harm that leaves no scar on the body and no entry in a hospital chart, and that is the harm of being watched. Of having an invisible institution decide that your opinions, your friendships, your phone calls, and your bedroom are all matters of national interest, and then quietly building a file on you while you go about your life believing you are free. Because it turns out the same government that was busy spraying cities and dosing soldiers was also keeping an extraordinarily close eye on the very citizens it claimed to be protecting, and the list of people it considered suspicious was long, strange, and occasionally hilarious. The targets were not foreign spies or enemy saboteurs, at least not mostly. They were ministers, professors, songwriters, students, and the kind of ordinary people whose most subversive act was showing up to a meeting and believing the country could be better than it was. The crown jewel of this effort was a sprawling domestic program run by the country's premier law enforcement agency, which operated from the mid-50s into the early 70s under the personal obsession of its long-serving director. On paper, its purpose was to monitor and disrupt groups that were considered subversive. In practice, it became a machine for spying on, harassing, and outright sabotaging Americans, whose only crime was holding political views the director did not like. And the director, it must be said, did not like a great many things. The program targeted civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, student movements, feminist organizations, and essentially anyone who seemed to be gathering a crowd and asking the country to do better. The tactics went far beyond simply listening. Agents planted false rumors to turn allies against each other, forged letters to break up marriages and friendships, leaked damaging information to sympathetic reporters, and pressured employers to fire activists, all with the goal of neutralizing movements from the inside before they could grow. One favorite trick was so effective and so cynical that it earned its own grim nickname inside the agency: the practice of making a loyal member of a group look like a secret informant. By spreading just the right whisper, planting a forged document, or arranging for one person to mysteriously avoid arrest while everyone around them got hauled in, agents could convince a tight-knit organization that one of its own was a traitor. The beauty of it, from the agency's coldly practical point of view, was that they did not have to do anything else. Paranoia did the rest. Trusted friends turned on each other, leaders were expelled or worse, and groups that had taken years to build tore themselves apart over betrayals that had never actually happened. In at least some cases, this manufactured suspicion is believed to have gotten people hurt or killed, all engineered from a desk by someone who never had to be in the room. Another campaign showed just how personal and petty the whole thing could get. A well-known actress had given financial support to a black activist organization, which was apparently more than the agency could tolerate. So agents cooked up a false rumor that she was pregnant by a prominent member of the group, and then deliberately leaked the fabricated story to a friendly gossip columnist, who printed a thinly veiled version of it. The woman, who was indeed pregnant but not in the way the rumor claimed, was so devastated by the public humiliation that her health collapsed. She went into early labor, and her baby did not survive. She never fully recovered, and her life unraveled in the years that followed. The agency had set out to embarrass a sympathetic celebrity, and ended up contributing to the death of an infant and the destruction of a woman, all over a donation, which is the sort of outcome that follows naturally when an institution decides that ruining people is just another item on the to-do list. The most notorious single act of the entire program was aimed at the most famous civil rights leader of the era, a minister whose advocacy of non-violence had made him a moral figure recognized around the world. The agency had been wiretapping him for years and had assembled recordings it believed were personally compromising. So somebody had the idea of mailing him an anonymous package containing some of this material, along with a letter. The letter, written to sound as if it came from a disillusioned supporter, called him a fraud and told him there was only one way out, strongly implying that he should end his own life, and it arrived not long before he was due to travel and accept one of the highest honours in the world for his work toward peace. Read that sequence again and let the sheer audacity of it settle. A government agency, using taxpayer money and the full machinery of federal investigation, attempted to push a Nobel Peace Prize laureate towards suicide by anonymous mail. His wife opened the package. The plan failed, the family endured it, and the leader went on to accept his prize. But the episode stands as one of the most chilling examples of a state turning its surveillance powers not toward protecting a citizen, but toward destroying him. The obsession behind it ran deeper than any single letter. The director had become personally fixated on this one man, convinced against all evidence that he was secretly controlled by foreign influence, and he poured astonishing resources into proving it. Hotel rooms were bugged wherever the leader travelled, his phones were tapped, his associates were monitored, and the recordings were compiled into a personal dossier that the director reportedly liked to share with select officials, less out of any security concern and more out of something that looked a great deal like spite. The justification on paper was national security. The reality, by every honest account, was that a powerful man with unchecked authority had decided he hated another man and used the entire apparatus of federal surveillance to act on it. When the official purpose of a multi-year wiretapping campaign boils down to one bureaucrat's grudge, you are no longer looking at intelligence work. You are looking at a personal vendetta with a government budget. The same broad effort had an even darker outcome in the case of a young and charismatic organizer in a major Midwestern city, a man in his early 20s who had become a rising leader in a movement the agency considered dangerous, partly because he was extraordinarily good at uniting people across racial lines and feeding hungry children through community programs, which is the sort of thing that apparently registered as a national security threat. The agency cultivated an informant who had worked his way into the man's inner circle, and that informant supplied the authorities with a detailed floor plan of the apartment where the leader slept, including exactly where his bed was located. In the pre-dawn hours of a December morning in 1969, a heavily armed police team raided the apartment and unleashed a barrage of gunfire. When investigators later examined the scene and counted the shots, the tally was damning. Of roughly 99 rounds fired, all but one came from the police. The single shot that could be attributed to the people inside may well have been a reflexive discharge from someone already dying. The young leader was killed in his bed, in a raid that looked far less like a shootout and far more like an execution guided by a map the agency had helpfully provided. His family and supporters fought for years to expose what had happened, and a long legal battle eventually forced a settlement, but the man himself was 21 years old and gone. There were details about that night that only deepened the suspicion. The informant who had drawn the floor plan was, by various accounts, close enough to the leader to have been in the apartment that very evening, and questions lingered for years about whether the leader had been so deeply asleep during the raid because he had been drugged, since he reportedly did not wake even as the gunfire erupted around him. Whatever the precise truth, the basic shape of the event was impossible to square with the official story of a fierce two-sided gun battle. You do not need a forensic degree to understand what it means when one side fires nearly 100 rounds and the other side fires once, if that. The raid was sold to the public as self-defense against dangerous militants, The physical evidence told the story of something closer to an ambush of sleeping people, planned with the help of a hand-drawn map of where the target would be lying. Lest you think the watching was reserved only for organisers and activists, the agency had a genuinely remarkable habit of building thick files on famous people whose primary offence seems to have been being interesting. The brilliant physicist who reshaped our understanding of the universe, a man whose name is shorthand for genius itself, accumulated a file running to well over 1,000 pages, largely because his outspoken support for peace, civil rights, and various left-leaning causes made the director deeply suspicious of him. The agency spent years investigating whether the most celebrated scientist on the planet was some kind of subversive threat, which tells you that no amount of fame or accomplishment was enough to put you above suspicion. If anything, fame made you more interesting to watch, because a famous person with the wrong opinions could influence a great many other people. In one striking case, a beloved silent film comedian, perhaps the most famous entertainer alive at his peak, was hounded for years over his left-leaning sympathies and his personal life, with a thick file accumulating as officials looked for a reason to be rid of him. When he left the country for a trip abroad, the authorities seized the opportunity and quietly revoked his ability to return, effectively exiling one of the most celebrated artists of the century over his politics. He did not set foot in the country again for 2 decades. The lesson the agencies seemed to draw from cases like his was not that they had overreached, but that surveillance and a well-stocked file could be turned into a weapon flexible enough to remove almost anyone, given enough patience and a convenient moment. Behind the famous names sat a far larger and more mundane reality, which was the practice of keeping files on enormous numbers of perfectly ordinary people. The law enforcement agency maintained an index of citizens it considered worth detaining in the event of a national emergency, a roster that at various points held the names of tens of thousands of Americans who had been flagged for nothing more than their associations, their reading habits, or their attendance at the wrong meeting. Subscribing to a particular magazine, signing a petition, or showing up at a rally could be enough to earn you a card in the system. Most of these people never knew they had been listed, never committed a crime, and never posed any threat, yet their names sat quietly in a cabinet, pre-sorted for a roundup that thankfully never came. It is a peculiarly bureaucratic kind of menace, the idea that somewhere a clerk had already decided you were a potential problem and filed you accordingly, all without your ever raising your voice above a whisper. The musicians fared no better. The former member of the most famous band in the world, who had reinvented himself as a peace activist and was using his enormous platform to oppose the war, generated a substantial file and became the target of a serious government effort to have him removed from the country entirely, with officials worried that his concerts and influence might sway young voters. The reasoning was that a man singing about giving peace a chance was a genuine threat to national stability, which is the kind of conclusion you can only reach if you have spent too long in a windowless office reading other people's mail. The legendary singer often called the queen of her genre, a woman whose voice defined an era, had a file of several hundred pages, swept up largely because of her associations with the civil rights movement and her support for activists. Even a gentle, wholesome folk singer famous for cheerful songs about mountains and country roads, about the least threatening public figure imaginable, reportedly turned up in the files, which suggests the net was cast so wide that it caught more or less everyone who ever held a microphone and an opinion. When your surveillance program flags a man whose biggest controversy was being too earnest about the Rocky Mountains, you may have lost the thread of what a real threat looks like. Taken together, these files paint a portrait less of a careful security service, and more of an institution that simply could not stop collecting, hoovering up the lives of poets, scientists and singers, with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a man who keeps every receipt he has ever been handed just in case. One of the eeriest cases involved a celebrated novelist, a giant of literature known for his rugged adventures and his terse, muscular prose. In his final years, he became increasingly convinced that he was being followed, that his phone was tapped, and that agents were watching his every move. His friends and doctors concluded he was suffering from paranoia, and he was hospitalized and treated for it, which only deepened his despair before he took his own life. Decades later, when his file was finally released, it turned out the agency had indeed been keeping tabs on him for years, monitoring his activities and his contacts. He had not been imagining the surveillance at all. He had been right, and had been treated as mentally ill for noticing the truth, which is a particularly cruel twist, to be driven to despair partly by a watching that everyone around you insists is a delusion, only for the files to prove you were the sane one all along. While one agency was busy building files on folk singers, the nation's Signals Intelligence Service was running an operation of staggering scope with almost no oversight. Going all the way back to the 1940s, this agency had quietly arranged for the major telegraph companies to hand over copies of essentially all the international cables passing through the country. A fire hose of private communications turned over wholesale, with the companies cooperating and the public knowing nothing. A later, related effort maintained a watch list of American citizens whose communications were to be intercepted, a list that grew to include not just suspected foreign agents, but anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, journalists, and even a couple of sitting senators who had been critical of government policy. This was the collection of private communications and metadata on a mass scale, decades before most people had any idea such a thing was technologically possible, let alone actually happening. When a famous whistleblower revealed the modern version of mass surveillance many years later and the country reacted with shock, the truth is that the basic practice was not new at all. It had simply been quietly running in the background, off the books, since before most of the people outraged by it had been born. The scale of the cable operation is worth sitting with for a moment. For around 3 decades, the major telegraph companies physically delivered or made available copies of their international traffic, which at the height of the program could mean well over 100,000 messages a month being scooped up and sifted. There was no warrant, no court oversight, and no law that clearly authorized any of it. The whole thing rested on a quiet handshake between the agency and a handful of corporate executives who decided on their own that cooperating with the government was simpler than asking awkward questions. When investigators eventually pried the program open, they found that it had operated for years in a kind of legal vacuum, neither clearly authorized nor clearly forbidden, simply assumed to be acceptable because nobody with the power to stop it had ever been told it existed. It is a useful reminder that some of the most extensive surveillance in the country's history was built not on some dramatic new law, but on the absence of anyone in a position to say no. The manipulation extended into the press itself, which is where things get particularly unsettling, because a free press is supposed to be the thing that catches all of this. For years, the intelligence community cultivated relationships with journalists, editors, and executives at major news organizations with reporters who would plant favorable stories, kill unfavorable ones, and serve as sources of information and cover for agents abroad. Some of these journalists were full participants who knew exactly what they were doing. Others were used more loosely, fed selected information, and nudged toward particular conclusions. The result was that a meaningful slice of what Americans read in their newspapers and magazines during this period had been quietly shaped, planted, or filtered by an intelligence agency, which rather complicates the comforting idea that the news was simply the news. The watchdog, in too many cases, had been quietly invited to share the agency's lunch. The reach of this arrangement was wider than most people would comfortably believe. By some accounts, the intelligence community at its peak had working relationships with hundreds of journalists, along with quiet ties to wire services, magazines, publishing houses, and broadcast outlets, the very institutions a citizen relied on to find out what their government was up to. Some reporters were on a kind of informal payroll. Others simply had a friendly contact who would call with a useful tip or a gentle request to hold a story for reasons of national interest. Foreign news bureaus made especially convenient cover, since a journalist could travel, ask questions, and meet people anywhere in the world without raising suspicion, which is precisely the skill set an intelligence agency values most. The long-term cost of all this was not just a handful of slanted articles. It was a slow poisoning of the well, because once it became known that some journalists had secretly worked for the government, every honest reporter inherited a little extra cloud of suspicion they had done nothing to earn. Trust, once spent that way, is remarkably hard to buy back. Not to be outdone by its domestic counterpart, the Foreign Intelligence Agency decided that it too wanted in on the business of spying on Americans at home, despite the small legal complication that domestic spying was explicitly not its job. From the late 60s into the mid-70s, it ran an illegal operation aimed squarely at the anti-war movement, opening mail, infiltrating activist groups, and compiling a vast index of American citizens that eventually contained files on hundreds of thousands of people. The justification was a conviction, never really supported by evidence, that the anti-war movement must be secretly funded and directed by foreign powers, because surely Americans could not be objecting to the war all on their own. Agents were sent to live among student groups and protest organizations, reporting back on people whose entire dangerous activity consisted of marching, chanting, and printing leaflets. The infiltration could reach almost comic levels of saturation. In some local activist chapters, so many of the members turned out to be informants, undercover officers, and paid sources that observers later joked the meetings were occasionally more government than movement, with planted agents earnestly debating strategy against other planted agents while the genuine activists sat between them with no idea. There are documented instances of an informant rising to a leadership position within a group, helping to plan its activities and even encouraging the very actions that would later be used to justify arrests, which raises the dizzying question of who exactly was organising whom. When the people stirring the pot and the people watching the pot are frequently the same people, the line between preventing trouble and manufacturing it gets very thin indeed. The activists, meanwhile, were left to navigate a world in which any new face might be a spy, any phone might be tapped, and any setback might be sabotage, a level of justified paranoia that wore people down as surely as any direct attack. When the operation was eventually exposed, the conclusion was uncomfortable for everyone involved, namely that the Foreign Intelligence Service had spent years building a massive surveillance file on its own citizens for exercising rights the country claimed to hold sacred, and had found, after all that effort, essentially no evidence of the foreign conspiracy it had been so sure it would uncover. The mail-opening side of this deserves its own moment of disbelief. For roughly 2 decades, agents quietly intercepted, opened, photographed, and resealed letters passing through certain postal facilities, reading the private correspondence of ordinary citizens and cataloguing anything that looked interesting. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of letters over the life of the program, steamed open in back rooms by people whose job was to read other people's mail and decide whether Grandma's update about the garden contained any hidden subversion. The senders and recipients had every reason to believe their letters were private, sealed and protected, because opening someone else's mail was, and is, plainly illegal. The agency simply decided the law did not apply to it, ran the program in secret for years, and built up a card index of names pulled from the correspondence. When it was finally uncovered, officials struggled to point to a single significant threat the entire effort had ever caught, which is a remarkable return on 20 years of professional envelope steaming. The volume alone is staggering to picture, an industrial operation devoted to reading the ordinary correspondence of a nation, letter by letter, and finding almost nothing for its trouble except the private words of people who had assumed, reasonably, that a sealed envelope meant what it had always meant. Perhaps the strangest and most quietly devastating campaign of the era targeted people not for what they believed or said, but for who they were. Beginning in the early 50s, a sweeping effort was launched to purge the federal government of gay and lesbian employees, on the theory that their private lives made them vulnerable to blackmail and therefore security risks, a justification that managed to be circular and cruel at the same time, since the only reason such blackmail was possible was that the government had made their identities a firing offence in the first place. An executive order formalised the policy, and over the following years thousands of dedicated public servants were investigated, interrogated about the most intimate details of their lives, and forced out of their jobs. Careers built over decades evaporated overnight. People were tailed, their friends were questioned, and many were pressured into naming others, turning the whole affair into a slow-motion engine of ruined lives. Some of those dismissed, unable to bear the shame and the sudden loss of everything they had worked for, took their own lives. The purge ran quietly for decades, ruining far more careers than the more famous political witch hunts of the same era. Yet it received a fraction of the attention, in part because the victims were given every reason to stay silent about why they had really been let go. Not everyone went quietly, though. One astronomer who had worked for the government's mapping service was fired under the policy, and rather than disappearing in shame as the system expected, decided to fight. He challenged his dismissal all the way up through the courts, and when that failed, he simply refused to stop, spending years organising, protesting publicly at a time when doing so took genuine courage, and arguing loudly that there was nothing wrong with him and everything wrong with the policy. He more or less single-handedly turned his own firing into the seed of a movement, insisting that the burden of shame belonged to the institution, not to the people it had cast out. It took decades, but the policy he fought was eventually dismantled, and a formal apology finally came long after most of those affected were gone. His story is the rare bright thread in this chapter, a reminder that the systems doing the watching were not invincible, and that sometimes the person they tried to erase refused to be erased, and rewrote the ending instead. What ties all of these threads together is a single corrosive assumption that ran through the entire apparatus, which was the belief that ordinary citizens, exercising the most basic rights a free society is supposed to guarantee, were a problem to be managed rather than a public to be served. Marching against a war, organising for civil rights, singing the wrong songs, loving the wrong person, holding the wrong opinions, all of it could land you in a file, on a watch list, or in the crosshairs of an agency with a budget far larger than your ability to defend yourself. And the truly insidious part was the invisibility of it. The men in the cities being sprayed with bacteria at least had a strange smell in the air to wonder about. The targets of surveillance often had nothing at all, no sign, no warning, just the slow accumulation of a record they did not know existed, assembled by people they would never meet, to be used in ways they could not predict. You could spend your entire life as a model citizen and never once suspect that somewhere, in a locked cabinet, your name sat at the top of a growing stack of pages. There is a particular flavour of unfairness in this that is worth naming. With a poison or a radioactive dust, however terrible, there is at least a cause and an effect, a moment of exposure you might one day connect to your illness. Surveillance offers no such closure. Its damage is diffuse and deniable, scattered across a lost job you could never quite explain, a friendship that mysteriously soured, a promotion that never came, an opportunity that quietly evaporated for reasons no one would put in writing. The targets often spent years sensing that something was wrong without being able to prove it, second-guessing their own instincts, wondering whether they were being paranoid, all while a real and documented machine hummed away in the background confirming that they were not. Being watched in secret does something corrosive to a person that a visible attack does not, because it teaches you to distrust your own judgment, to wonder whether the strange coincidences in your life are coincidences at all. The genius of the whole system, if you can call something so destructive ingenious, was that it made its victims doubt their own sanity as a side effect of doing exactly what they feared. The whole sprawling system only came undone through a combination of luck and nerve. A group of ordinary citizens, frustrated and suspicious, broke into a small field office of the law enforcement agency one night, while the country was distracted by a major boxing match, and they walked out with armloads of secret documents. When they mailed those documents to journalists, the public finally got its first concrete proof that the surveillance was not paranoid fantasy, but documented fact, with the agency's own paperwork describing programs to monitor and disrupt lawful political activity. That break-in, carried out by people who were never caught, and who only revealed themselves decades later, did more to expose the machinery of domestic spying than any official ever did voluntarily. It forced congressional investigations, public hearings, and a wave of reforms, and it confirmed in black and white what the targets had only been able to suspect, which is that the watching had been real, vast, and aimed squarely at the people the institution was sworn to protect. The cabinet, it turned out, had been very real, and it had been a great deal fuller than anyone outside it had dared to imagine. The investigation that followed pulled back the curtain on the whole apparatus in a way nothing before had managed. A special committee in the Senate spent more than a year digging through the secret programs, hauling intelligence officials in front of the cameras, and forcing the agencies to explain, on the record, what they had been doing all those years. The hearings produced a parade of revelations so steady that the public almost grew numb to them, each week bringing a fresh disclosure about another program nobody had known existed. At one memorable moment, an investigator held up a dart gun the intelligence service had developed to deliver poison without leaving a trace, a device that looked like something from a spy film and turned out to be entirely real, which rather undercut the official insistence that the agencies had always operated within sensible limits. The committee's final reports ran to thousands of pages and documented assassination plots, mass surveillance, illegal break-ins, and the systematic targeting of lawful dissent. The reforms that came out of it, including new rules and a special court meant to oversee surveillance, were real and meaningful, though anyone who has followed the decades since knows that the appetite for watching has a way of quietly reasserting itself the moment everyone stops paying close attention. The watchers were caught, scolded, and partly reined in. They were not, it turns out, cured. Everything we have looked at so far happened, more or less, at home, to the country's own citizens. But the same agencies that bugged ministers and dosed soldiers were operating on a far larger stage abroad, and out there the rules thinned out to almost nothing. At home, a single break-in could expose a secret program and force a reckoning. Overseas, there was no congressional committee waiting in the wings, no nosy local reporter with subpoena power, and no real expectation that anyone would ever be held to account. So the toolkit that had been used to disrupt a protest group at home got scaled up and pointed at entire countries, with results that reshaped the world map and cost an almost incomprehensible number of lives. Because if there is one thing the Cold War taught the intelligence world, it was that overthrowing a foreign government was often considered far easier and far cheaper than persuading one. It helped enormously that the public back home almost never found out. A domestic scandal had voters, newspapers and elections attached to it, mechanisms that could eventually force the truth into daylight. A coup in a distant capital had none of that. By the time any of these operations was even partially declassified, the leaders who ordered them were often retired or dead. The foreign country had moved through several governments, and the public attention span had long since wandered elsewhere. This near-total absence of consequences created a strange moral weightlessness around the whole enterprise. A planner could sign off on toppling an elected government before lunch and face precisely no risk of ever being asked about it, which is exactly the kind of arrangement that encourages people to do things they would never dare attempt if anyone were watching. Remove accountability entirely, and you discover what institutions are willing to do when they are confident no one will ever know. The template that taught everyone how to do this was set early, in 1953, in a country sitting on an enormous supply of oil. A democratically chosen leader there had made the entirely reasonable decision that his nation's oil ought to benefit his nation rather than a foreign corporation that had been pumping it out and keeping most of the profit. He moved to nationalize the industry, which is the sort of thing that tends to attract attention from the people whose profits are being nationalized. A foreign government, alarmed at the precedent and lobbied hard by the oil interests, decided this would not stand. So the intelligence service was sent in to remove him, not with an army, but with money, propaganda, and manufactured chaos. Agents bribed politicians, paid newspapers to print attacks, and most ingeniously, hired crowds to stage violent demonstrations, including some that pretended to be supporters of the leader behaving badly, the better to turn the public against him. They orchestrated the appearance of a country falling apart, and then offered the strongman they preferred as the solution to the very disorder they had created. The elected leader was toppled, placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, and a monarch was installed with sweeping powers and a notoriously brutal secret police. For a quarter century this arrangement held, until it collapsed in a revolution that produced a regime deeply hostile to the country that had engineered the original coup, which is the kind of long-term outcome that should have prompted some serious reflection, but mostly did not. What makes the operation especially instructive is how cheap and theatrical it really was. There was no grand invasion, no fleet, no army marching on the capital. The whole thing was essentially a stage production with a modest budget, in which the script called for a country to appear to be tearing itself apart so that a rescuer could ride in. Paid agitators were sent into the streets to riot and loot, some of them posing as devoted followers of the elected leader, so their bad behaviour would be blamed on him. Clergy were bribed, generals were courted, and the press was flooded with planted stories. The lead agent on the ground later wrote about the affair with the satisfied tone of a man describing a clever business deal, which captures the unnerving casualness of it. An entire nation's democratic future was rerouted by a relatively small sum of money, a few well-placed bribes, and a talent for manufacturing chaos on cue. The blowback, when it came decades later, would cost vastly more than the operation ever saved, but that bill landed on a future desk, and future desks have a way of not factoring into present decisions. The very next year, the same playbook was dusted off and used again, this time in a small nation to the south where a reform-minded president had committed the unforgivable sin of trying to redistribute unused land to landless farmers. Much of that idle land happened to belong to a powerful fruit company with deep political connections, a corporation so dominant in the region that it effectively functioned as a shadow government, owning the railroads, the ports, and vast plantations. The company did not appreciate the idea of handing its unused acreage to peasants, and it had friends in very high places. A campaign was launched to paint the reformer as a dangerous radical aligned with foreign powers, a charge that was convenient precisely because it justified intervention. The intelligence service trained and armed a small rebel force, backed it with a propaganda radio station broadcasting fake news of an unstoppable advancing army, and rattled the capital with overflights and threats until the president, convinced he was facing an invasion that mostly existed on the airwaves, simply gave up and fled. What followed was not the stable, friendly democracy that had been promised. It was decades of military rule and a brutal civil war that dragged on for around 40 years and claimed something on the order of 200,000 lives, the overwhelming majority of them civilians. All of this so that a fruit company would not have to part with land it was not even using, which is a price in human life so wildly out of proportion to the cause that it almost defies belief. The decades that followed were not a vague background of unrest, but a specific grinding catastrophe. The country cycled through a series of military strongmen, and in the worst stretch of the long war, the army carried out a scorched earth campaign against the rural indigenous population, wiping out entire villages on the suspicion that they might be sympathetic to leftist rebels. A later Truth Commission would document hundreds of massacres and conclude that acts of genocide had been committed against indigenous communities. Through much of this, the regimes doing the killing continued to receive support and training from abroad, the original intervention having locked the country into a trajectory it could not escape. The fruit company, for its part, did not even prosper in the long run, eventually fading and restructuring as the world moved on, which adds a final layer of bleak absurdity. A democracy was destroyed, and a 40-year nightmare set in motion to protect the interests of a business that would not even survive to enjoy the spoils. The land disputes that started it all now read like the pettiest possible reason to drown a country in blood, which is precisely what they were. The pattern, once established, kept repeating with grim reliability. In Central Africa at the start of the 1960s, a newly independent nation elected a charismatic young leader who spoke passionately about genuine independence and refused to simply hand his country's vast mineral wealth back to its former colonial masters. This made him intensely inconvenient to several powerful interests at once. He was branded a dangerous figure who might align with rival powers, and a decision was made at high levels that he needed to go. The intelligence service explored a range of options for eliminating him, including, by its own later admission, plots involving poison, though events on the ground moved faster than the poison plot could. He was captured by rivals, beaten, and killed. His body disposed of so thoroughly that there was almost nothing left to bury, with foreign hands tangled up in the events that led to his death, even if the final blow was struck by others. The country he had hoped to lead toward real independence instead fell under a long, corrupt, and friendly dictatorship that suited outside interests just fine, and a man who had been one of the great hopes of African independence was gone before his mid-30s. The assassination planning in his case veered into territory so strange it would be comic if it were not aimed at a human life. According to later testimony, a scientist working for the intelligence service was dispatched to the region carrying poison meant for the leader, with one of the contemplated methods being to contaminate something as intimate and everyday as his toothpaste, so that he would essentially brush his teeth to death. The plot was never carried out in that form, overtaken by the faster and cruder violence of his local enemies. But the very fact that serious professionals sat in offices designing a way to murder a head of state through his bathroom sink tells you how routine the unthinkable had become. When poisoning a foreign leader's toiletries is just one option on a planning memo, the moral compass of the institution has stopped pointing anywhere useful. Perhaps the most infamous example of the whole genre unfolded in a long, narrow country on the western edge of South America in 1973. There, voters had elected a socialist president through an entirely ordinary democratic process, which presented the inconvenient problem of a freely chosen government pursuing policies that powerful outside interests strongly disliked. The response was a sustained effort to make the country's economy scream, in the chillingly candid phrase used at the time, by squeezing it financially, funding opposition groups and strikes, and quietly encouraging the military to consider its options. The squeeze was deliberate and patient. Loans and aid dried up, credit became impossible to find, and money flowed to the opposition press and to the trade groups whose strikes could paralyze the country, all designed to manufacture the impression of a government that could not keep the lights on or the trucks running. The strategy was one of engineered hardship, inflicting economic pain on millions of ordinary people in the hope that their suffering would curdle into the kind of crisis that justifies a takeover. On a September morning, the armed forces finally moved, surrounding and bombing the presidential palace from the air, while the president made his final radio address to the nation. The president died that day, and power passed to a general who would rule for the better part of 2 decades. What came next was a dictatorship that disappeared, tortured, and murdered thousands of its own people, with bodies dropped into the ocean and a generation taught to live in fear. The country that had helped set the coup in motion maintained warm relations with the new regime for years, the discomfort of its methods apparently outweighed by the comfort of its politics. In the days right after the takeover, the regime herded thousands of suspected opponents into a large sports stadium in the capital, turning a place built for football matches into a holding pen and an interrogation centre where many were tortured and a number were executed. Among those killed there was a beloved folk singer and songwriter, a gentleman whose music had given voice to ordinary people, which made him exactly the sort of figure the new rulers wanted silenced. Over the years that followed, the regime perfected the chilling practice of making people simply vanish, arresting them in the night and ensuring they were never seen again, leaving families to spend decades not knowing whether a son or daughter was alive or dead. Some of the disappeared were drugged, loaded onto aircraft and dropped into the sea, a method designed specifically to leave no body and therefore no evidence. The tidy diplomatic warmth maintained with this government, even as these facts trickled out, is its own kind of indictment, a reminder that for the planners abroad, a friendly dictator who tortured the right people was always preferable to an unfriendly democrat who simply held the wrong opinions. If those examples involved a great deal of careful manipulation, the events in a vast island nation in Southeast Asia in the mid-60s showed how monstrous the consequences could be when the intervention was more direct. Amid a power struggle, the military there launched a campaign to wipe out the country's large communist party and anyone suspected of sympathizing with it. The slaughter that followed was one of the worst mass killings of the entire 20th century, with estimates of the dead ranging from 500,000 to well over 1 million people. Neighbours turning on neighbours, rivers reportedly clogged with bodies. The disturbing detail that emerged decades later from declassified documents was that officials from the intervening country had actively supported the purge, and in a particularly grim contribution had handed the military lists containing the names of thousands of suspected communists, effectively serving up a target roster for the killing. They then quietly tracked the progress of the massacre, treating the elimination of a political movement as a satisfactory outcome rather than a horror. To compile names and pass them to people you know intend to kill, and then to monitor the body count with approval, is about as far from clean hands as a government can get while still insisting its hands are clean. The internal records from that period, when they finally surfaced, made for uncomfortable reading. Diplomats stationed in the country sent cables back home discussing the killings in measured, almost administrative language, noting the progress of the campaign as one might track a construction project. There was a sense not of alarm but of quiet satisfaction that a major political force was being dismantled, regardless of the staggering human cost. The list handed over reportedly contained thousands of names, and officials later acknowledged that they expected the people on those lists to be killed or captured, which is what happened. For decades afterward, the full extent of this support was kept hidden, and the massacre itself was treated in much of the world as a confusing internal upheaval rather than what the documents revealed it to be, a slaughter that a foreign government had quietly cheered along and materially assisted. The survivors and the families of the dead spent generations unable to even speak openly about what had happened, living alongside the very people who had carried out the killings, while abroad the whole affair was filed under the comforting heading of a communist threat successfully contained. These were not isolated incidents or the work of a few rogue operators. When historians later tallied it up, the count of attempted regime changes, coups, and efforts to install or remove foreign leaders in the decades after the Second World War ran to well over 50 separate cases. More than 50 times, in other words, the machinery was aimed at someone else's government. Some succeeded outright, some failed and were quietly buried, some backfired so spectacularly that they created the exact threat they had been meant to prevent. But the sheer number reveals that this was not an occasional emergency measure, reluctantly taken in a genuine crisis. It was a standard tool, reached for again and again, a normal part of how the country conducted itself in the world, even as it presented itself publicly as the great defender of democracy and self-determination. The gap between that public image and the private practice is one of the widest in modern history. A thread worth pulling on runs through several of these stories, which is how often the deciding interest was not strategy or ideology at all, but money. The oil under one country, the unused plantations in another, the price of sugar in a third, the mineral wealth of a fourth. Behind the lofty language of freedom and security, you keep finding a corporation that stood to lose a fortune if a particular government got its way, and a quiet alignment between that corporation's bottom line and the levers of state power. The genius of the arrangement, from the corporate point of view, was that the company never had to dirty its own hands or pay for its own private army. It simply made its case to friendly officials, framed its commercial problem as a national security threat, and let the machinery of government do the expensive and bloody work of protecting its profits. The bill, as always, was paid by people who had never owned a share of anything. It is a strange and bitter alchemy, the way a dispute over a balance sheet in a boardroom could be transmuted, through a few classified meetings, into a coup, a war, and a generation of graves on the other side of the world. Not every attempt was a grim success, and some descended into a level of farce that would be hard to believe if it had not been laid out in official testimony. One particular island leader just to the south became the target of an assassination effort, so prolonged and so creatively incompetent that it has become legendary. Over the years, the plots reportedly included a box of cigars treated with a toxin, another batch rigged to explode, a diving suit dusted with disease-causing fungus and infested at the breathing apparatus, a poisoned pen fitted with a hidden needle, and a scheme to lace his food with a chemical that would make his famous beard fall out, on the theory that humiliating him into looking foolish might somehow loosen his grip on power. None of it worked. The leader outlasted not only every one of these schemes, but most of the officials who dreamed them up, dying peacefully of old age many decades later, which is perhaps the single most humiliating possible outcome for an agency that had treated his removal as a matter of national urgency. The episode is funny in the way that only colossal, well-funded failure can be, though it is worth remembering that behind the exploding cigars sat a sincere and sustained intention to kill a man, which is rather less amusing than the props suggest. There is a pattern running through nearly all of these adventures that the planners seemed congenitally unable to see, which is that interventions have a way of generating the very enemies they were meant to prevent. The coup that installed a hated monarch produced a revolution that birthed a hostile state. The leaders propped up as friendly strongmen often became corrupt tyrants, whose misrule radicalized their own populations. The movements crushed in one decade reconstituted themselves, angrier in the next. Intelligence professionals even have a tidy word for this: blowback, meaning the unintended and delayed consequences of a covert operation that come boomeranging back home, often years later and often misunderstood by a public that was never told about the original operation in the first place. The grim comedy of it is that the same institutions kept reaching for the same tool, decade after decade, apparently confident that this time the overthrow would be clean, the strong man would behave, and the consequences would stay safely abroad. The consequences rarely cooperated. They had a habit of buying a return ticket. The methods grew more systematic as the years went on. In the southern cone of South America during the 70s and into the 80s, a cluster of military dictatorships, many of which had come to power with outside encouragement, decided to pool their resources for a coordinated campaign of repression. They built a shared system to track down, share intelligence about, kidnap, torture and murder their political opponents across national borders, so that a dissident who fled one country could be hunted down and eliminated in another, with the cooperating regimes passing each other names and even carrying out killings on each other's behalf. The campaign reached out to silence critics far beyond the region, including an assassination carried out on the streets of a major foreign capital, a car bombing that killed a former official of one of the regimes along with an innocent bystander. The intervening superpower was aware of this transnational murder network, provided communication support and training that helped it function, and for a long time looked the other way, because the regimes doing the killing were considered reliable allies against the common ideological enemy. It was, in effect, a multinational corporation for the disappearance of human beings, and it had a powerful silent partner. One of the most haunting features of this system was its treatment of the children of the disappeared. When a young woman was abducted while pregnant, the regimes would sometimes keep her alive just long enough to give birth, then murder her and hand the newborn to a family aligned with the dictatorship, to be raised with no knowledge of who its real parents had been. Hundreds of infants are believed to have been taken this way, their identities erased along with their parents. In the decades since, a determined group of grandmothers has worked tirelessly to find these stolen grandchildren, using genetic testing to reunite now-grown adults with the truth about their origins, a heartbreaking and ongoing effort to undo a crime designed to be permanent. That a network of governments could be so methodical about not just killing dissidents, but rewriting the family histories of their children, all while a superpower provided the communications backbone that let them coordinate, gives some sense of how industrialized cruelty had become. This was not the heat of battle. It was paperwork, logistics, and filing systems applied to the business of making people and even their bloodlines disappear. The same logic of elimination by list, which we saw applied so catastrophically in Southeast Asia, was also built into a program run during the long war in Vietnam. The stated goal was to identify and neutralize the hidden civilian network that supported the enemy insurgency, the shadow infrastructure of officials, supporters, and organizers operating among the population. In practice, neutralize was a word doing an enormous amount of quiet work. The program relied on informants, interrogations, and a quota system, and it resulted in the killing of more than 26,000 people over its run, along with the capture and detention of tens of thousands more. The trouble with a program built on tips, quotas, and pressure to produce results is that it becomes an open invitation for abuse. People settled personal scores by naming rivals as enemy agents. Interrogations under torture produced false confessions and false accusations, which led to more arrests and more interrogations in a self-feeding cycle. Many of those killed or detained were almost certainly innocent civilians caught in a machine that rewarded numbers over accuracy. When the metric for success is a body count, the machine will always find a way to hit its targets, and it will not be too fussy about whether the bodies belong to the right people. The program operated through a network of regional interrogation centers, and the accounts that later emerged from people who worked within it were grim. Detainees were subjected to brutal treatment in the search for information about the insurgent network, and the pressure to feed the quota system meant that suspicion alone, sometimes based on nothing more than a single uncorroborated accusation, could be enough to mark someone for capture or death. Some who served in the program later spoke out about what they had witnessed, describing it as something that had drifted far from any defensible purpose into routine killing that swept up the innocent, alongside any genuine targets. Defenders argued that it did real damage to the enemy's hidden organization, and perhaps it did. But the price was a system in which a frightened villager could be turned into a statistic by a neighbor's grudge, and in which the very act of measuring success in corpses guaranteed that the corpses would keep coming whether or not they belonged to anyone who had ever lifted a weapon. It is the same poisoned logic we saw in the mass killings elsewhere, the conviction that you can make a society safe by working through a list, scaled down to the level of individual villages and individual knights. It would be comforting to think this kind of meddling was a product of the Cold War, a temporary madness born of a unique ideological struggle. But the habit was far older than that, stretching back well into the 19th century, and one of the clearest early examples did not involve a distant nation at all, but a kingdom that would eventually become part of the country itself. In the islands of the Central Pacific there ruled a queen, the last monarch of an independent island kingdom, who was working to restore power to her people and reduce the outsized influence of foreign business interests, chiefly wealthy plantation and sugar owners who had grown rich on the islands. These businessmen had no intention of letting a monarch trim their power, so a small group of them, with the crucial backing of armed marines who came ashore from a warship conveniently anchored offshore, staged a coup. Faced with foreign troops on her soil and unwilling to see her people slaughtered in a hopeless fight, the queen yielded under protest. Her kingdom was taken, a republic friendly to the business interest was declared, and within a few years the islands were absorbed entirely. More than a century later, the government that had engineered all this formally apologized for the role its forces had played in overthrowing a peaceful sovereign monarchy, an apology that arrived, as these apologies tend to, long after every person who could have heard it firsthand was gone. The timing of the takeover was, of course, not the slightest bit accidental. The business owners behind it had grown enormously wealthy, growing and exporting sugar, and they had a powerful financial motive to bind the islands as tightly as possible to the mainland market, since being treated as part of the country rather than a foreign supplier would spare them costly tariffs. Their concern, in other words, was not abstract principle but the price of sugar. The Queen, who had ascended the throne determined to push back against exactly this kind of foreign domination, found herself outmanoeuvred by men who could summon armed sailors to their cause with a quiet word to a sympathetic official. She protested formally, appealed for justice, and even travelled to plead her people's case. But the machinery of annexation ground forward regardless, and within a few years the independent kingdom that had existed for generations had been swallowed whole. It is a story that tends to get left out of the cheerful tourist brochure version of the island's history, the part where a sovereign nation was taken from its people at gunpoint so that a handful of plantation owners could improve their margins. What links all of these episodes together, from the Queen in the Pacific to the socialist president in the palace, is a single quietly arrogant assumption, which was that the country doing the intervening had the right to decide who should govern other people, and that this right outweighed the inconvenient preferences of the people actually being governed. Time and again, a foreign population would make a choice, electing a leader or pursuing a policy, and that choice would be overruled from the outside because it threatened a corporate profit, a strategic interest, or an ideological line. The justification offered was almost always the defence of freedom, which is a remarkable thing to call the act of overthrowing a government that the people had freely chosen, and the costs were rarely borne by the planners who signed off on these operations from comfortable offices far away. They were borne by the farmers, the dissidents, the families, and the ordinary citizens of the countries on the receiving end, who paid in dictatorships, civil wars, disappearances, and mass graves for decisions made about them, without them, by people who would never have to live with the result. And perhaps the most disorienting thing about this entire chapter of history is how thoroughly it was hidden in plain sight. These were not whispered legends or unverifiable rumours. They are reconstructed from the planner's own cables, memos, and testimony, the paper trail of bureaucrats who genuinely believed, at least at the time, that they were doing necessary work and who therefore wrote much of it down. The exploding cigars, the lists of names, the cheerful diplomatic cables tracking a massacre, the apology issued a century after a kingdom was stolen, all of it sits in the archive, declassified and footnoted, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. The countries on the receiving end have never had the luxury of forgetting, because they are still living inside the consequences, in the politics, the poverty, and the buried traumas left behind. It is only on the side that did the intervening that these events have a way of slipping out of the national memory, tucked into a paragraph of a history class if they appear at all, which is its own quiet kind of disappearing act, the most successful covert operation of all being the one that erases itself from the story afterward. Overthrowing a foreign government in the shadows is one thing, since it can be done quietly with a few bribes and a fake radio station. Sending an entire nation off to a real, declared war is something else entirely, because that requires the public to go along with it. You cannot draft a few 100,000 young men and ship them across an ocean to fight and die without giving the people back home a reason they will accept. And here we arrive at one of the oldest and most reliable tricks in the whole repertoire, which is the manufactured reason, the incident that did not quite happen, the threat that was not quite real, the intelligence that was quietly bent into whatever shape the people who had already decided to fight happened to need. Because it turns out that the hardest part of starting a war is not the fighting. It is convincing everyone that you had no other choice. The clearest modern example unfolded in the summer of 1964, in the warm waters off the coast of Southeast Asia. There were 2 reported incidents involving warships and small enemy boats just a couple of days apart. The first one was real enough, a genuine if minor naval skirmish. The second, the one that actually mattered, the one that was rushed to leaders and used within days to justify a massive escalation, appears never to have happened at all. The sailors involved reported phantom signals on their instruments, the kind of false readings that nervous crews on a dark and stormy night can easily mistake for an attack, with one commander cabling that the whole thing might be the product of jumpy radar operators and overeager sonar. There were no enemy boats, there was no second attack. But the decision to widen the war had effectively already been made, and a convenient incident was exactly what was needed to sell it. Within days, a resolution sailed through the legislature granting sweeping war powers, and the country plunged into a conflict that would drag on for years. The truly damning part did not emerge until decades later, when an internal study by the nation's own Signals Intelligence Agency was finally declassified in 2005 and confirmed what skeptics had long suspected. The intelligence about that second attack had not merely been mistaken, it had been mishandled and misrepresented, with the doubts stripped out and the alarming bits emphasized, so that leaders received a clean story of unprovoked aggression rather than the messy, doubtful reality. By the time the truth was officially acknowledged, the war it had helped launch was long over, having cost the lives of well over 50,000 of the country's own troops and a staggering number of Vietnamese, with estimates of the dead there running into the millions when soldiers and civilians on all sides are counted. A war that reshaped a generation, divided a country, and killed an almost unimaginable number of people had been kicked off, in part by an attack that the best evidence says was a case of mistaken sonar readings on a jittery night. What makes it sting all the more is that the doubts were not some secret only revealed by historians long after everyone had forgotten. They existed in real time. The commander on the scene sent urgent messages within hours, urging that no further action be taken until the reports could be confirmed, warning that freak weather and an overeager sonar operator likely accounted for the supposed contacts. Those cables of caution made their way up the chain and were then essentially set aside, because by that point the alarming version of events was already racing toward the capital and into a prepared resolution that had, by some accounts, been drafted well before the incident it supposedly responded to. Decades later, one of the senior officials most associated with the war would admit in his memoirs that the second attack had never happened, a confession that arrived far too late to matter to the millions who had already paid for the mistake. It is a sobering demonstration of how a war can outrun the truth, how a doubt expressed on day one can be buried under a momentum that no amount of later honesty can reverse, and how the machinery of escalation once started becomes almost impossible to stop with mere facts. If that feels like an unfortunate accident magnified by people who wanted a war, the next major example removes any doubt that the process can be deliberate. In the lead-up to the invasion of a certain country in the early 2000s, the public was presented with an alarming and specific case. This nation, the world was told, possessed terrible weapons capable of mass destruction, and was a grave and gathering threat that could not be allowed to stand. The evidence was laid out with great confidence. There were said to be mobile laboratories on trucks, secretly producing biological agents while roaming the desert to avoid detection. There were aluminum tubes, supposedly imported to build the centrifuges needed for a nuclear program. And there were documents indicating that the country had tried to buy a large quantity of uranium ore from an African nation. It was a compelling, frightening picture, and it carried the country and several allies into a full-scale invasion. Then the inspectors went in, and the picture dissolved like sugar in the rain. The mobile biological laboratories turned out to be trucks for generating hydrogen to fill weather balloons, which is about the most harmless thing a truck can do short of selling ice cream. The aluminum tubes were, on closer examination, the wrong specifications for nuclear centrifuges and far better suited to conventional artillery rockets, exactly what the country said it had bought them for, and the documents about the uranium purchase from Africa were eventually exposed as crude forgeries, riddled with errors so basic that they included officials who were no longer in office, and a signature from a minister who had left his post years earlier. The sort of mistakes a careful forger would be embarrassed by. The stockpiles of forbidden weapons that had justified the entire war were never found, because they did not exist. What had happened, as later investigations made painfully clear, was that the decision to go to war had come first, and the intelligence had been hunted, cherry-picked, and stretched afterward to support a conclusion that had already been reached. Doubts were buried, caveats were deleted, and shaky sources were treated as solid, all to build a case for something that was going to happen regardless of what the evidence actually said. The story of the mobile laboratories deserves a special mention, because the entire frightening claim rested largely on a single informant, a defector who had told a friendly intelligence service a vivid tale of secret germ factories on wheels. The trouble was that this source was regarded by some of the people who had actually dealt with him as unreliable at best, and a fabricator at worst, a man with obvious motives to tell his hosts what they wanted to hear in exchange for a comfortable new life. His claims had never been verified, and warnings about his credibility were raised and then waved away as the march to war gathered speed. Years afterward, the man himself reportedly admitted that he had simply made it up, that he had invented the mobile weapons labs out of a desire to help bring down the regime he despised, and that he was frankly amazed anyone had believed him. So a substantial pillar of the public case for a war that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives traced back to the imagination of one motivated storyteller whose own handlers had doubted him. When the standard of evidence for invading a country drops to whatever the most motivated witness is willing to say, you're no longer gathering intelligence. You're commissioning a script. These are the cases where the deception was woven into intelligence reports. But there is a far more shocking document in the historical record, one that shows just how far some planners were willing to go, because it lays out a scheme to deliberately attack and kill the nation's own people in order to manufacture a reason for war. In the early 60s, with leadership eager to find a justification to invade a small island nation that had become an irritant, the top military commanders drew up and unanimously endorsed a plan of breathtaking cynicism. The proposal was a menu of staged provocations designed to be blamed on the island's government. The ideas included faking attacks on the country's own military base, sinking boats carrying refugees, orchestrating a campaign of violence in major cities, and even, in one chilling suggestion, arranging the apparent shooting down of a civilian airliner to be accomplished by swapping the real plane for a remotely controlled drone that would be blown up after the passengers, who would be agents travelling under fake names, had been secretly offloaded. The goal was to whip the public into a fury and provide an airtight pretext for invasion. The plan was presented to the civilian leadership, and to the enormous credit of the president at the time, it was firmly rejected and never carried out. But the document survived, was eventually declassified, and stands as proof that the idea of murdering one's own citizens to start a war was not the paranoid fantasy of conspiracy theorists. It was a formal proposal, typed up, signed off on, and sitting in a folder, waiting for a yes that thankfully never came. The cold thoroughness of the document is what unsettles people most when they read it today. This was not a vague brainstorm scrawled on a napkin. It was a detailed staff plan, complete with proposed operations, suggested locations, and an internal logic about how each fabricated outrage could be exploited in the press to build public support. Some of the proposals involved staging incidents and then producing carefully prepared casualty lists and funerals to stir national grief and anger. Others involved sabotaging equipment and blaming the enemy, or faking the harassment of civilian aircraft and ships. The plan even contemplated how to handle the inevitable journalists, with the expectation that a properly managed wave of media coverage would do half the work of selling the war. That serious senior people sat in a room and worked all this out in such practical detail, treating the deliberate killing or endangering of their own citizens as a logistics problem to be solved, rather than a line that could never be crossed, is the part that lingers. The plan was rejected at the top, which is genuinely to the credit of the leadership that said no. But the fact that it had to be rejected, that it got far enough to require a no, tells you that somewhere in the building the unthinkable had already become just another option on the table. That same willingness to consider the unthinkable showed up in another startling episode from a few decades earlier, though this one was aimed not at a foreign enemy but at the country's own government. In the depths of an economic catastrophe, with a new president pushing reforms that alarmed certain wealthy interests, a plot reportedly took shape to remove him by force and install a more business-friendly figure as a kind of strongman. The conspirators needed a popular military leader to lead a march of veterans on the capital, and they approached a famous and highly decorated retired general to be their figurehead. Assuming a man of his reputation could rally the troops, they had picked the wrong man. The general listened to their proposal, played along just long enough to learn the details, and then marched straight to a congressional committee and blew the whole thing wide open, testifying about the approach in detail. The accused interests denied everything. No one was ever prosecuted, and the affair was downplayed and largely forgotten. But the committee concluded that there was credible evidence a plot had indeed been discussed. It remains a strange and underexplored footnote, the time a celebrated general was allegedly asked to overthrow his own government, and decided instead to tell on the people who asked. The instinct to bury the ugly truth of a war runs deep, and it stretches back much further than most people realize, to a conflict at the very turn of the 20th century that has been almost entirely scrubbed from the popular memory. After taking control of a chain of islands from a fading colonial power, the country found that the local population had its own ideas about independence and was not interested in simply swapping one distant ruler for another. What followed was a brutal war of suppression that lasted several years and turned savage. Soldiers used a torture technique that involved forcing enormous quantities of water into a prisoner's stomach until it was painfully distended, then forcing it back out, a method that was openly discussed and even joked about in letters home at the time, though it would later be recognised for exactly the torture it was. After local fighters ambushed and killed a group of the occupying soldiers in one town, a commander reportedly ordered his men to turn the surrounding region into a howling wilderness, and to kill everyone above a certain young age who might be capable of bearing arms. The civilian death toll across the war climbed into the staggering range, with estimates of those who died from violence, famine and disease running as high as several 100,000. Yet this war is barely mentioned in the country's classrooms, a conflict of that scale and brutality somehow fitting into a sentence or two, if it appears at all, which is a remarkable feat of national forgetting. Part of how the death toll climbed so high was a tactic borrowed from the colonial powers of the age, the practice of herding rural civilians into guarded camps to separate them from the fighters they might otherwise shelter and feed. Inside these crowded enclosures, with sanitation poor and food scarce, disease spread quickly and people died in large numbers, not from bullets, but from the simple, grinding consequences of being forced off their land and packed together with nowhere to go. The countryside outside the camps was then treated as a free fire zone, where anything that moved could be considered hostile. There was also an ugly current of racism running through the whole campaign, with soldiers and officials in letters and reports describing the local population in dehumanizing terms that made the killing easier to rationalize, the same grim psychological trick that has accompanied atrocities throughout history. The bells looted from one devastated town as war trophies became a sore point that lingered for over a century, finally returned only in recent years as a belated gesture of acknowledgement. For a war that helped establish the country as a global power and that killed civilians on such a scale, the silence around it in the popular memory is almost its own kind of cover-up. The slow and quiet kind, achieved not by shredding documents, but by simply declining to mention them to the next generation. The thread tying this whole grim collection together is the simple, uncomfortable insight that in case, after case, the decision to fight came first, and the justification was assembled afterward. The intelligence did not lead to the war. The war led to the intelligence. Whether it was a phantom attack on a dark sea, a forged document about uranium, a typed proposal to fake a terror campaign, or a brutal suppression quietly erased from the textbooks, the pattern holds. Once the people in power have decided they want a war, the facts become raw material to be shaped, and the truth becomes an obstacle to be managed rather than a guide to be followed. The official reason for a war and the actual reason are, distressingly often, two completely different things, and the gap between them is usually filled with the bodies of people who believe the official version. Lying to start a war is one way to dirty your hands, but the Cold War offered a subtler and arguably more corrosive kind of compromise, which was the friendly handshake with monstrous people in the name of a greater good. The reasoning was always the same and always seductive. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and if working with a torturer, a tyrant, or even a war criminal helps in the great struggle against the larger foe, then so be it. This logic produced some of the most disturbing alliances imaginable, and it began before the Cold War had even properly started, in the wreckage of the Second World War. As that war ended and the next great rivalry loomed, the country found itself in a desperate scramble to grab the best scientific minds and the most advanced technology before its rival could. The catch was that many of the best minds in fields like rocketry happened to have spent the previous years working for the very regime that had just been defeated, and not a few of them had been enthusiastic members of its party or had overseen operations that relied on brutal forced labour. Rather than let principle get in the way of a good rocket scientist, a secret program was set up to quietly bring more than 1,600 of these specialists into the country, scrub or rewrite the inconvenient parts of their histories, and set them up with new careers, new respectability, and in some cases a hero's welcome. The most famous of them became a celebrated public figure, the genial face of the country's space ambitions, beaming on television while explaining the wonders of spaceflight, with his past as the developer of weapons built by concentration camp prisoners tactfully omitted from the broadcast. Another senior figure from the same rocket program enjoyed decades of acclaim before the truth about his connection to that brutal forced labour finally caught up with him late in life, prompting him to quietly leave the country to avoid losing the citizenship he had been so generously granted. The trade was explicit. useful knowledge in exchange for a laundered past, and the country decided the knowledge was worth more than the justice. The irony reached almost surreal heights in the years that followed. Men who had helped build weapons that rained down on foreign cities, designed and assembled with the labour of prisoners worked to death in underground factories, were now drawing comfortable salaries, raising families in pleasant suburbs, and being honoured at ceremonies as pioneers of progress. Schoolchildren wrote them admiring letters. Their accents, once the sound of the enemy, became the charming trademark of brilliant men of science. Investigators who had spent the war documenting atrocities found that the very people whose files they had been building were now untouchable national assets, their histories sealed or sanitized by the same government that had once vowed to bring such men to account. It was a quiet decision, made in offices and never put to a public vote, that the demands of the new rivalry simply outweighed the claims of the recently dead. The country had fought a long and costly war partly in the name of stopping a monstrous regime, and then, the moment the shooting stopped, it went shopping for that regime's most valuable employees, no questions asked, or rather plenty of questions asked and then carefully unasked. That same calculus, the willingness to trade principle for advantage, surfaced again and again throughout the Cold War in ever more tangled forms. In one of the most convoluted scandals of the era, officials secretly sold weapons to a nation that was supposedly a sworn enemy, a country the government publicly refused to deal with and had branded a sponsor of terror. The point of the sales was partly to win the release of hostages and partly to generate a secret pile of cash. And what was the cash for? To fund a rebel army fighting a leftist government in Central America at a time when the legislature had explicitly passed a law forbidding exactly that kind of funding. So the scheme managed to violate the country's stated principles and its actual laws in a single elegant motion, selling arms to a declared enemy in order to secretly bankroll a war the people's representatives had specifically voted against. When it all unravelled, there were hearings, a handful of convictions that were later overturned or pardoned, and a great deal of testimony about shredded documents and faulty memories. But the fundamental audacity of it remained. The idea that a government could simply root around its own laws when it found them inconvenient. The operation had been run largely out of a basement office by a small circle of staff who treated themselves as a kind of shadow foreign policy, free to ignore the law because they were certain their cause was righteous, which is precisely the mindset that laws against secret wars exist to restrain. The willingness to arm dangerous figures for short-term gain produced a particularly bitter harvest in the case of a brutal dictator in the Middle East. During a long war between that dictator and a regional rival, the country quietly tilted toward the dictator, providing intelligence, financial credits, and the sale of materials that could be used to build chemical weapons, the dual-use precursors and equipment that a determined regime could turn toward poison gas. The unsettling part is that the support continued even as it became clear what the dictator was doing with these capabilities. When his forces unleashed chemical weapons on a town full of his own ethnic minority citizens, killing thousands of men, women and children in a single horrifying attack, the response from his foreign backers was muted, the relationship preserved because he was, for the moment, useful against the larger rival. Years later, when that same dictator became the enemy, his use of chemical weapons would be cited as a reason he was a monster who had to be stopped, with the awkward detail of who had helped equip him quietly left out of the speeches. There is a famous photograph from this period of a senior envoy warmly shaking the dictator's hand, a friendly meeting that took place at roughly the same time his regime was already known to be using chemical weapons on the battlefield. The image is a near-perfect snapshot of the whole arrangement, the cordial smile of a partnership that the country would later pretend had never happened. When the dictator gassed the town full of his minority citizens, the initial official reaction even floated the possibility of blaming the atrocity on his regional rival instead. Anything to avoid disrupting a useful relationship. Only after he stopped being useful, after he invaded a neighbour and made himself the new villain, did that gas attack get promoted in the official telling from an inconvenient embarrassment to a defining example of his evil. The crime was always monstrous. What changed was simply whether it was convenient to say so out loud, which is perhaps the most honest summary of how these alliances worked. The same act could be a regrettable footnote or a casus belli depending entirely on whether the perpetrator was, at that particular moment, a friend or a foe. The same pattern of arming today's friend who becomes tomorrow's nightmare reached its most consequential expression in the mountains of Central Asia. To bleed its great rival, which had invaded a neighboring country, the intelligence service funneled billions of dollars in weapons and money to the local fighters, resisting the occupation, building them into a formidable insurgency. It was, in the short term, a strategic success, helping to drain the rival in a long and costly war. The longer-term consequences were considerably less rosy. The networks, weapons, and battle-hardened fighters nurtured during that conflict did not simply evaporate when the rival withdrew. Some of them coalesced into the very movements that would later turn their guns on their former benefactors, including the group that would eventually seize control of the country, and the network that would go on to carry out the most devastating attack the benefactor nation had ever suffered on its own soil. The men who had been celebrated as freedom fighters in one decade became the archetypal enemy of the next, armed in no small part with the help of the country that would later spend 20 years and untold treasure fighting them. The scale of the original effort was enormous, growing into one of the largest covert operations the intelligence service had ever run, with the funding swelling year after year and being matched by a wealthy regional ally, channeled through a neighboring country's spy agency to the various factions of fighters. Among the weapons supplied were advanced shoulder-fired missiles capable of knocking aircraft out of the sky, which proved devastatingly effective and which later became a serious headache, since once you have handed out hundreds of portable missiles to loosely organised fighters in a war zone, getting them all back afterward turns out to be considerably harder than handing them out was. The deeper problem was philosophical as much as logistical. The strategy had deliberately favoured the most zealous and uncompromising fighters, on the reasonable-sounding theory that the most fanatical were also the most effective against the occupier. But fanaticism, once cultivated and armed and victorious, does not simply retire and take up gardening. It looks for the next cause. And so the networks built to fight one war became the seedbed for movements that would define the conflicts of the following decades, a textbook case of a short-term victory purchased at a catastrophic long-term price that nobody on the planning side seemed to have seriously contemplated. The roster of uncomfortable alliances goes on. After a regime carried out one of the worst genocides of the century, murdering roughly a quarter of its own population in a few short years of madness, geopolitical convenience led the country and its allies to support that same regime's continued recognition on the world stage, because the rival power had been the one to drive it from office, and propping up the genocidal faction was seen as a way to spite the rival. A government that had presided over mountains of skulls was, for years, treated as the legitimate representative of its nation in international halls, an arrangement that beggars belief until you remember the governing logic of the whole era. Elsewhere, when much of the world moved to isolate and sanction a regime built on brutal racial segregation, the country's leadership at one point resisted, with a president vetoing a sanctions bill on the grounds that the segregationist government was a reliable partner against communism, a veto that the legislature thankfully overrode. For years, the official posture toward that regime was one of so-called constructive engagement, a polite phrase for continuing to do business with a government that denied the basic humanity of most of its own people, on the theory that gentle persuasion would work better than pressure. It was a stance that placed the country, for a time, on the opposite side from the very movement that the rest of the world would soon celebrate as one of the great moral causes of the century, an embarrassment quietly smoothed over once the regime fell and everyone hurried to claim they had been against it all along. And when a small territory was invaded and brutally occupied by a larger neighbour, with the occupation eventually killing an enormous share of the small territory's population, declassified records later showed that senior officials had given the invasion their quiet blessing during a visit just before it began, effectively waving it through. That last case is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the documents are so blunt. The senior officials were physically in the neighbour's capital, meeting with its leader, almost literally on the eve of the invasion, and the records of the conversation show them being informed of what was about to happen, and responding not with objection, but with a request that it be done quickly, and that they be out of the country before it started, so as to avoid any awkward appearance of endorsement. The weapons used in the invasion were supplied by the same official's country in apparent violation of agreements that those weapons be used only for defence. Over the years of occupation that followed, through famine, massacres, and forced relocations, a share of the small territory's population died that, proportionally, ranks among the worst such losses anywhere in the modern era. And for most of that time the wider world barely noticed. The suffering of a tiny remote place easily overlooked, when the powerful had quietly agreed it was not worth a fuss. It took decades and a great deal of pressure before the territory finally won its independence, long after the people who had waved the invasion through had moved on to comfortable retirements and respectful obituaries. What unites every one of these grubby bargains is the same self-flattering story the planners told themselves, that the greater struggle justified the lesser evil, that a monster on your side was preferable to a saint on the other, and that history would forgive the compromises once the larger battle was won. The trouble is that the monsters rarely stayed conveniently on the right side. The weapons handed out had a way of being turned around, and the people crushed in the service of these grand strategies were just as dead. Whether they were killed by an official enemy or by a friend, the country had armed, trained, and protected. The enemy of my enemy, it turns out, is very often just another enemy you have not met yet, and the bill for befriending him always comes due eventually, usually with interest. Befriending criminals for strategic reasons is bad enough, but there is a line beyond even that, the point at which the government stops merely tolerating the trafficker and quietly becomes the trafficker itself. Because tucked into the long history of the so-called war on drugs is the deeply awkward fact that the same institutions waging that public war were, at various points, helping to move the very substances they claimed to be fighting, and on other occasions were deliberately poisoning their own citizens in the name of stopping them from indulging. It is one of the great contradictions of the whole story, a state that built prisons and slogans around the evils of narcotics while, in the shadows, its own aircraft, allies and chemists were busy spreading exactly the poison it warned everyone else about. The contradiction was not a matter of a few bad actors freelancing either. It ran right through the official posture of the era, in which the dangers of drugs were treated as a national emergency, worthy of vast budgets, stern television campaigns, and harsh laws, all while the practical priorities of intelligence work kept quietly cutting across that message. The two things were allowed to coexist because the people running the public campaign and the people running the secret operations were rarely the same and were never required to answer for one another. The government could be sincerely against drugs in one breath and materially complicit in their spread in the next, without anyone in charge feeling the contradiction sharply enough to stop it. The clearest case grew out of a secret war in the mountainous jungles of Southeast Asia, where the intelligence service was running a covert operation against communist forces and relied heavily on local hill tribes as fighters and allies. These tribes had one main cash crop, and it was not rice. It was the poppy, the raw source of opium and heroin, and it was the only thing standing between many of these villages and starvation. The agency, needing to keep its allies happy and funded, found itself in the position of running an airline, a fleet of cargo planes flying through some of the most rugged terrain on Earth, ostensibly to ferry supplies and personnel for the secret war. The trouble, or the convenience depending on your point of view, was that those same planes were also used to move the Allies' opium harvest out of the remote highlands to where it could be processed and sold. The agency did not need to personally bag the drugs. It simply provided the transport network that made a remote landlocked drug trade viable, looking the other way because the alternative was alienating the fighters it depended on. What made the whole thing especially tidy was that the airline existed as a real, functioning business with a perfectly respectable public face. It flew genuine cargo, carried genuine passengers, ran rescue missions, and looked from the outside like an ordinary if adventurous freight operation working in a difficult part of the world. That legitimate front was precisely what made it so useful, because nobody questions the cargo manifest of an airline that is, on paper, just doing its job. Pilots flew into tiny dirt airstrips carved out of the jungle, loaded whatever the local commanders handed them, and flew it back out, with a culture that strongly discouraged curiosity about the contents of the sacks. The arrangement let the agency maintain complete deniability. It was not trafficking drugs, it would insist. It was merely running an airline that served allies who happened to grow poppies, and what those allies chose to ship was their own affair. This is the sort of distinction that sounds meaningful in a briefing room, and dissolves entirely the moment you remember that without the planes, the drugs would have stayed stuck in the mountains. The transport was the trade. You cannot run the only road out of a place and then claim no responsibility for what travels down it. A grim portion of that heroin made its way into the veins of the country's own soldiers fighting nearby, who returned home with addictions acquired in a war their government was fighting with the help of the people growing the drug. The bitter symmetry is hard to miss. The young men sent abroad to fight in the name of stopping a creeping menace came home, carrying a different menace entirely, one their own side had helped keep in circulation, and they would spend years battling it in living rooms and clinics far from any front line. The institution warning teenagers at home about the dangers of narcotics was, on the other side of the world, running the airline that kept a heroin pipeline open. The consequences of that arrangement followed the soldiers home in a way nobody had planned for. By the late stages of the war, heroin had become alarmingly cheap, pure, and available to troops in the region, and a significant share of them came back with a dependency they had picked up far from home, in a conflict where the drug was practically part of the scenery. The country suddenly faced waves of returning young veterans struggling with addiction, a public health crisis that prompted urgent new programs, and a great deal of official hand-wringing about where all this heroin was coming from. The answer, awkwardly, was partly the very allies the government had armed and the very planes the government had flown, though that was not the version offered in the speeches. There is a special kind of absurdity in a government declaring a national emergency over an addiction crisis among its soldiers, while quietly running the logistics that helped supply the drug in the first place, like a man complaining loudly about the leak in his roof that he himself has been drilling. The pilots who flew those routes later spoke in some cases about what everyone on the ground had simply understood, that questioning the cargo was not part of the job and that the mission came first, contents unexamined. If that arrangement could be excused as an accidental byproduct of a messy secret war, the next chapter is harder to wave away, because it happened closer to home and the warnings were louder and more ignored. During the campaign to fund the Central American rebel army we encountered earlier, the one the legislature had explicitly forbidden the government from bankrolling, a desperate need for money collided with a convenient source of it. Cut off from official funds, the operation became hungry for any cash it could find, and that hunger created exactly the kind of moral blind spot in which uncomfortable partners start to look acceptable. Some of the people connected to that rebel cause were also involved in moving cocaine into the country, and the intelligence service, which was working hand in glove with the rebels, was in a position to notice. The deeply uncomfortable conclusion that emerged from later investigations was not that the agency had personally set up street corner sales, but that it had known certain of its assets and allies were involved in drug trafficking and had chosen to look the other way, unwilling to disrupt a relationship it considered strategically vital. A Senate investigation toward the end of the 80s documented links between the rebel support network and drug traffickers, and nearly a decade later the agency's own internal watchdog produced a report admitting, in the careful language of such documents, that the agency had indeed worked with individuals it knew or suspected to be involved in the drug trade, and had not exactly rushed to cut ties or alert law enforcement. The Senate inquiry was led by a senator who had not set out to uncover anything so explosive, and who found the implications of his own findings genuinely disturbing. His committee concluded that traffickers had been part of the rebel supply operation, that some had received money and assistance, and that government officials had known about the problem and failed to act on it, prioritizing the larger covert mission over the small matter of drugs entering the country. The findings were detailed, sober, and damning, and they were also, at the time, largely shrugged off, buried under the general assumption that this sort of thing was simply too outlandish to be true. It is a recurring feature of this whole history that the official confirmation, when it finally comes, tends to arrive quietly and late, in a dry report that almost nobody reads, long after the public has already decided the matter was the stuff of conspiracy theory. The confirmation lands with a whisper precisely because admitting it loudly would require reckoning with what it means, and reckoning is expensive, so the truth gets filed under closed, and everyone moves on. The senator himself reportedly remarked afterward on how little appetite there had been, anywhere in the system, to follow the trail to its uncomfortable end. In plain terms, fighting communism was the priority, and if some cocaine flowed into American cities as a side effect of keeping that fight funded, that was a cost the agency was apparently willing for other people to bear. The timing of all this made it especially devastating because it coincided with the arrival of crack, a cheap, smokable, intensely addictive form of cocaine that tore through poor urban neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Whole communities were hollowed out, families fractured, and a generation of young people swept into addiction or into the brutal violence of the trade that grew up around it. The same government whose tolerance had helped keep the cocaine flowing then responded to the resulting epidemic by launching a ferocious crackdown, passing harsh new sentencing laws that filled prisons to bursting, with the heaviest penalties falling precisely on the crack that devastated poor neighborhoods, rather than the powdered form favoured in wealthier ones. So the people in those communities got it from both ends. First, the product was allowed to reach them, and then they were imprisoned in enormous numbers for using and selling it, locked up under laws written as if the drug had simply materialised out of nowhere rather than arriving through channels the government had every ability to shut down and chose not to. It is difficult to design a more perfect trap if you tried. A population offered the poison with one hand and the prison cell with the other. The sentencing disparity baked into the laws meant that the same quantity of the drug could draw wildly different punishments, depending on its form, which in practice meant, depending on the neighbourhood and the colour of the person caught with it, a piece of supposed colour-blind justice that managed to be neither. The story of how this came to light is itself one of the most cautionary tales in the history of journalism. In the mid-90s, an investigative reporter at a regional newspaper published a deeply researched series tracing how cocaine connected to that rebel network had flooded into a major city and helped fuel the crack epidemic that was devastating poor neighbourhoods. The series landed like a bomb, but rather than rallying behind the reporting, much of the established national press, perhaps stung that a smaller paper had broken such a story, turned on the reporter, picking apart his work, magnifying his overreaches and treating his central, well-supported findings as if they had been debunked. The pile-on was relentless and effective. His own paper eventually backed away from the series, his career collapsed, and he was pushed out of mainstream journalism, unable to find serious work despite having been fundamentally right about the core of what he reported. The bitter irony is that the agency's own later report would go on to confirm much of what he had alleged about the agency, turning a blind eye to trafficking by its allies, vindicating him in substance even as his professional life lay in ruins. The mechanics of his destruction are worth understanding, because they did not require anyone to prove him wrong. They only required the appearance of doubt. The major national papers assigned teams of reporters not to advance his story or investigate the underlying scandal, which would have been the obvious move, but to scrutinise his reporting itself, hunting for any imprecision, any claim that had been stated too strongly, any gap they could widen. They found a few, as any investigation of that scope will contain, and they used those small cracks to dismiss the whole edifice, writing pieces that left the casual reader with the impression that the entire affair had been overblown nonsense. It was a masterclass in how to bury an inconvenient truth without ever directly denying it, by simply changing the subject from what the government did to whether the messenger had dotted every I. His editors, facing the combined weight of the National Press Corps turning against one of their own, lost their nerve and effectively disowned the work. The reporter found himself professionally radioactive, unable to land a job at any serious publication, his name turned into a cautionary byword for journalistic overreach, when in truth his great sin had been getting a real story mostly right, and embarrassing the institutions that should have gotten it first. The end of his story is the part that still raises eyebrows. Years after the controversy, broke and struggling, the reporter was found dead in his home from gunshot wounds, and the death was officially ruled a suicide. What gave many people pause was a detail that strains the ordinary meaning of the word, which is that he had reportedly been shot in the head not once but twice. A single self-inflicted shot is tragically common. Two is the kind of thing that makes people who have read too many of these stories raise an eyebrow, even though medical examiners noted that such a thing is physically possible in rare cases. The official finding was reviewed and upheld, and there has never been credible evidence pointing to anyone else in the room. Officially, it was a suicide by a despairing man whose life had fallen apart. Unofficially, it joined the long list of inconvenient deaths that the more suspicious corners of the public would never quite accept at face value. Whatever the truth of his final moments, the broader lesson of his life was clear enough. He had told a true and important story about his government, and the machinery of respectable opinion had destroyed him for it, long before any bullet did, which is its own kind of warning to anyone tempted to follow in his footsteps. In the years after his death, the verdict on his work slowly and quietly reversed. As the agency's own admissions sank in, and as the harshness of his treatment came to look less like accountability, and more like a hit job by a wounded press establishment, his reputation began to recover. Some of the very journalists and outlets that had piled on came to acknowledge, in retrospect, that he had been treated unfairly, and that the core of his reporting had held up far better than the core of their attacks on it. His story was eventually retold sympathetically, with the focus shifted to where it always should have been, onto the scandal he exposed and the cost he paid for exposing it. It is a hollow kind of vindication, the sort that arrives after a man is in the ground and can no longer enjoy it, useful mainly as a lesson for the living. The pattern it illustrates is grimly consistent throughout this entire history. The person who tells the uncomfortable truth is punished first and believed later, and the believing, when it finally comes, is generally too late to do them any good. Now, drug trafficking by omission is one flavour of this contradiction, but there is an even starker example from earlier in the century in which the government did not merely tolerate a poison, but actively manufactured one and pumped it into the supply, knowing full well it would kill people. During the years when the sale of alcohol was banned outright, the country had a small problem, which was that an enormous number of citizens had no intention of stopping drinking and were happily buying bootleg liquor distilled from industrial alcohol. Industrial alcohol was already deliberately made undrinkable through additives, a process meant to keep it out of the beverage trade, but enterprising bootleggers employed chemists to clean it back up and turn it into something passably drinkable, a cat-and-mouse game the authorities found deeply annoying. The government's response to this was not to give up on the ban, it was to order that industrial alcohol be poisoned more aggressively, adding substances specifically chosen to be difficult to remove and dangerous to consume, including wood alcohol and other toxic chemicals, in the explicit hope that a few deaths would scare people away from drinking. People did not stop drinking, they simply died. The bootleggers could not always fully purify the more heavily poisoned alcohol, and the deadly batches went out to consumers who had no way of knowing which bottle would merely get them drunk and which would blind or kill them. Over a single holiday season in one major city, dozens of people died from poisoned liquor in the space of a couple of days, with hospitals filling up with the dying and doctors who understood exactly what they were seeing but could do little about it. By the time the ban was finally repealed, the toll from the deliberately poisoned supply ran into the thousands, with some estimates reaching around 10,000 deaths. The chilling thing is that this was not an accident or a failure of oversight. It was the policy working as intended, or at least as some of its architects had explicitly hoped, a calculated decision that killing some of its own citizens was an acceptable way to discourage a behaviour the government disapproved of. There were officials who defended it openly, arguing that anyone who died had done so by their own choice to break the law, a piece of reasoning that conveniently ignored the small matter of the government being the one adding the poison. It remains one of the rare instances where the state can be said to have run a mass poisoning campaign against its own population on purpose, complete with a paper trail, and the public reaction at the time was a great deal more muted than you might expect. There was a grim arms race at the heart of it. The government would order more potent and harder to remove poisons added to the industrial alcohol, and the bootleggers would hire ever more skilled chemists to try to strip those poisons back out, a chemical duel in which the casualties were the drinkers caught in the middle. The poison was also no respecter of intentions. It could not tell the difference between a hardened lawbreaker and a working person buying a cheap drink at the end of a long shift, and it fell hardest on the poor, who could not afford the better quality smuggled liquor and were stuck with the dangerous bottom-shelf product most likely to be lethal. The wealthy, meanwhile, sipped imported spirits that had never been anywhere near an industrial vat. There was at least one prominent public health official of the era who denounced the policy in furious terms, calling it nothing short of legalized murder by the government and keeping a running count of the bodies piling up in the city morgue. His protests were largely ignored by an administration committed to the ban, which had decided that a certain number of dead drinkers was simply the price of enforcing virtue, an early and especially literal example of a government concluding that the ends justified poisoning the means. When the ban was finally lifted, it was not because of the deaths, which had never generated the outrage they deserved, but because the whole experiment had become an obvious failure that fueled organised crime, corrupted the police, and emptied the treasury of tax revenue. The poisoning programme simply ended along with it, quietly, without any great reckoning, no trials, no apologies, no monument to the thousands who had died drinking liquor their own government had laced. It slid into the history books as a quirky footnote of the era, remembered, if at all, as a colourful detail about the lengths the authorities went to, rather than as what it actually was, a deliberate policy that knowingly killed citizens by the thousand. The episode endures as perhaps the purest distillation of a theme that runs through this entire account, the willingness of a government to treat the lives of its own people as an acceptable cost in pursuit of a goal it has decided matters more, and the remarkable ease with which the survivors and historians later agree to file the whole thing under unfortunate rather than monstrous. The contradiction did not end with the Cold War or with old prohibitions either. It surfaced again, in a strange new form, in the operation to track down the world's most wanted terrorist leader after he had eluded capture for years. Intelligence had narrowed his likely location to a particular compound in a particular town, but they wanted certainty before launching a risky raid, and one way to get it was to confirm whether his family was inside by collecting their genetic material. The plan they hit upon was to organise a fake vaccination campaign in the area, recruiting a real local doctor to go door to door offering what looked like a legitimate immunisation programme, with the actual goal of obtaining DNA samples that might match the target's known relatives. The campaign was, in the narrow sense, a clever piece of tradecraft. In every other sense, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen, because it took one of the most important and trust-dependent tools in all of public health and turned it into a cover for a spy operation. The decision reflected a kind of tunnel vision that recurs throughout these stories, in which a single, urgent objective so dominates the thinking of the people pursuing it that everything else, including consequences that any outsider could see coming a mile away, simply drops out of view. To the operators focused on confirming a target, the vaccination ruse was an elegant solution to a specific problem. The question of what it might do to vaccination efforts globally, or to the safety of health workers, or to the world's long campaign against preventable disease, was somebody else's department, and in the heat of the hunt, somebody else's department might as well not exist. This is precisely how institutions talk themselves into self-defeating decisions, by narrowing the frame until the only thing visible is the immediate goal, and the only relevant question is whether the trick will work. It usually will work, in the narrow sense. The trouble is that the world is not actually divided into separate departments, and a clever trick played on public health in one place ripples outward into a loss of faith that respects no borders. The damage, once the ruse became public, was severe and lasting. In a part of the world where suspicion of foreign-backed health programs already ran deep, the revelation that a vaccination drive had been a front for an intelligence operation confirmed the worst fears of every skeptic and conspiracy peddler. Vaccination workers, many of them local women doing dangerous and poorly paid work to protect children from disease, were suddenly seen as potential spies, and a number of them were attacked and killed by militants who used the scandal as justification. Parents who might once have welcomed the vaccinators now slammed their doors, and immunisation rates in the region fell. The disease that the world had spent decades and billions of dollars trying to wipe from the face of the earth, a crippling illness that had been pushed to the very brink of eradication, came surging back in the affected areas, paralysing children who might otherwise have been protected. What makes this especially galling is how close the finish line had been. The global effort to eliminate that particular disease was one of the genuine triumphs of modern cooperation, a decades-long campaign that had driven a once common scourge into a handful of final strongholds, with the goal of becoming only the second human disease ever deliberately wiped out. The remaining holdout regions were exactly the kind of suspicious, hard-to-reach places where every vaccination required patiently earned trust, and where a single confirmed betrayal could undo years of careful relationship building in an afternoon. By handing the skeptics concrete proof that a vaccination drive really could be a foreign plot, the operation did not just cause a local setback, it threatened to stall the entire global eradication effort at the worst possible moment, allowing the disease to dig back into the very last places it had been clinging to. A campaign that could have ended in history books as a permanent human victory instead got a fresh lease on life, courtesy of a spy operation that treated the most trusted symbol of public health as a disposable prop. Future generations may yet pay for that trade in cases that should never have happened, which is a long and quiet tale of consequences for a single clever idea. In the cold ledger of a single intelligence operation, the math may have looked acceptable. The confirmation of a high-value target weighed against some diplomatic awkwardness. In the wider human ledger, the operation helped sabotage one of the greatest public health achievements in history and got dedicated health workers murdered, a price that continues to be paid by children who had nothing to do with any of it. The local doctor recruited to run the fake campaign paid dearly as well. After the operation became known, he was arrested by his own country's authorities, who regarded his cooperation with a foreign intelligence service as a betrayal, and he was sentenced to a long prison term, becoming a kind of human casualty of the scheme caught between two governments. The deeper wound, though, was to something harder to measure than any single life, which was trust. For decades, public health campaigns had laboured to convince wary communities that the people showing up with needles and sugar cubes were there to help, not to harm or to gather secrets. A fragile faith built one reassuring visit at a time. A single operation shattered that faith in the places that could least afford to lose it, handing every rumour-monger and extremist a true story to point to. You can rebuild a destroyed building far more easily than you can rebuild a population's belief that the medicine offered to their children is safe, and the resurgence of a disease the world had nearly conquered stands as the bill for that lesson, still being tallied years later in clinics that now face locked doors where there used to be open ones. The thread running through all of these episodes is a particularly bitter one, because it cuts directly against the image the government most like to project, the image of itself as the protector of public health and safety standing guard against the corrupting influence of drugs and disease. In reality, when it served some larger goal, that same government was willing to fly the drugs, ignore the trafficking, poison the supply and weaponize the medicine. The institution lecturing its citizens about saying no to narcotics was running the airline. The government warning about the dangers of drink was the one spiking the bottle. The agencies that championed the eradication of disease were the ones who poisoned the public's trust in the very vaccines that could deliver it. Each time, the justification was that the larger cause, whether fighting communism, enforcing a moral law, or catching a terrorist, was important enough to excuse a little collateral damage among the people the government claimed to serve. And each time, the people who bore that collateral damage, the addicted soldiers, the poor neighbourhoods flooded with cocaine, the holiday drinkers, the paralysed children, never got a vote on whether their suffering was an acceptable price for someone else's strategy. The war on drugs, it turns out, had a great many fronts, and on more than one of them the government was quietly fighting for the other side. There is one more uncomfortable observation worth making before we leave this particular swamp, which is how neatly the public messaging concealed the private behaviour precisely by being so loud. The more strident the official war on drugs became, the harder it was for anyone to imagine that the same government could be complicit in the trade, because surely an institution that locked up so many people and ran so many earnest campaigns could not possibly be flying the product or laundering the profits. The volume of the public stance functioned as camouflage for the private contradiction. It is the same trick a magician uses, drawing your eye to the dramatic gesture of one hand so you never notice what the other is quietly doing. A government shouting loudly enough about a problem can buy itself a great deal of room to be part of that problem, because the shouting itself becomes the alibi. By the time the documents surfaced and the reports were filed confirming what had really gone on, the public had long since been trained to associate the government with the war against the poison, rather than with the poison itself, which is exactly the association the noise was designed to produce. Most of what we have covered so far needed the cover of darkness, the shredded file, the classified stamp, the official denial. But some of the gravest harm the country inflicted on its own people never needed to hide at all, because it was written openly into the law, debated in legislatures, blessed by the highest courts, and carried out in broad daylight by people who saw nothing to be ashamed of. There is a peculiar horror in injustice that does not bother to whisper, that puts its name on the paperwork and expects to be thanked, and nowhere is that more visible than in the long domestic record of the country, doing terrible things to its own citizens, not as a secret operation, but as ordinary accepted policy. The foundation of all of it was an institution that lasted roughly 2.5 centuries, in which millions of human beings were owned as property, bought and sold, worked without pay, and brutalized under the full protection of the law. When that system finally ended, there was a brief and remarkable moment when it looked as though some measure of justice might follow. There was a wartime order that set aside large tracts of coastal land to be redistributed to newly freed families in plots, an arrangement that became famous under the shorthand promise of a parcel of land and a mule to work it, the closest the country ever came to giving the formerly enslaved a material stake in the nation they had built for free. Tens of thousands of people began settling that land, planting crops, and daring to imagine a future. And then it was simply taken back. After the assassination of the president, his successor reversed the order, evicted the families, and handed the land back to the very people who had previously owned both the land and, in many cases, the people now being thrown off it. The mule, needless to say, did not arrive either. The cruelty of the timing is hard to overstate. The families who had begun working that coastal land were not asking for charity. They were, in the most literal sense, asking to keep the fruits of land they had already started to cultivate after lifetimes of labour for which they had never been paid a cent. For a brief window they were landowners, taxpayers, and citizens with a foothold in the economy, exactly the kind of self-sufficient independence that might have changed the entire trajectory of the following century. Then a stroke of a pen took it back, and the message could not have been clearer. The land, and the power and security that came with it, was going to remain with the people who had always held it, and the formerly enslaved would be sent back to work that same land, only now as nominally free labourers trapped in arrangements that kept them perpetually in debt to the landowner. It was freedom in name carefully engineered to function as bondage in practice, and it ensured that the enormous wealth generated by generations of unpaid labour would stay exactly where it had always been, never flowing back to the people who had created it. The reversal set the tone for everything that followed. Not only did the formerly enslaved receive no compensation for generations of stolen labour, but in a detail so backwards it sounds invented, there were arrangements in which the slaveholders were the ones compensated, paid for the loss of their human property as though the real victims of abolition had been the owners. In the capital district, a compensation scheme actually paid former masters a sum for each person they could no longer legally own, while the people who had been owned got nothing, not a coin, not an acre, not an apology. So at the very birth of freedom, the financial logic was already inverted. The country found money to soothe the people who had done the enslaving, and found nothing at all for the people who had been enslaved, a precedent of who deserves to be made whole that would echo through everything that came after. It is worth pausing on how completely this inverted any ordinary sense of justice. In nearly every other context, when a wrong is righted, it is the victim who is compensated and the wrongdoer who pays. Here the logic was flipped on its head, with the wrongdoer treated as the injured party and reimbursed for the loss of his ability to do further wrong, while the actual victims were expected to be grateful merely for the cessation of their suffering. The reasoning, such as it was, treated enslaved people as property in the very act of freeing them, since you only compensate someone for property they have lost, which means the compensation scheme tacitly affirmed the thing abolition was supposed to repudiate. This was not an oversight or a quirk of accounting. It was a clear statement, written into the public finances, about whose losses the society considered real and whose it considered beneath notice, and that statement set the template for the long pattern of apologies arriving generations late, and compensation, when it came at all, being modest, grudging, and aimed at survivors too few and too old to be made whole by it. What rushed in to fill the space where slavery had been was a system so similar that contemporaries openly described it as slavery wearing a different hat. The new laws abolishing slavery had contained a quiet exception, allowing forced labour as a punishment for crime, and certain states discovered they could drive a fleet of trucks through that loophole. They passed a thicket of petty laws, criminalising things like being unemployed, being out after dark, or simply being unable to prove you had a job, statutes designed and enforced almost exclusively against the recently freed population. The language of these laws was often carefully neutral on its face, never mentioning race directly, but everyone involved understood exactly who they were for, and the arrests fell with a precision that left no doubt. A man walking home from one job to another could be stopped, found to lack the right piece of paper, and swept into a system from which he might never emerge, all without having done anything that would have troubled anyone of a different background. Once arrested on these flimsy charges and unable to pay the fines, a person could be leased out to private companies, mines, plantations and railroads to labour under conditions that were frequently worse than slavery had been. And that is not rhetorical exaggeration. Under the old system, an enslaved person was at least an expensive investment the owner had a financial reason to keep alive. Under the leasing system, the company did not own the worker and faced no such loss if he died, so there was every incentive to extract maximum labour with minimum care, and the death rates in some of these camps were horrific. This arrangement, this slavery by another name, persisted in some places well into the 20th century, with one state not formally ending the practice until the late 1920s, more than 6 decades after slavery had supposedly been abolished. The economics of it were grotesque in their efficiency. Whole industries came to depend on this captive labour, with states earning a tidy income by renting out their prisoners, and companies enjoying a workforce they could drive as hard as they liked. Men were sent down into coal mines, out onto turpentine farms, into brickyards and onto chain gangs building roads, chained at night, fed barely enough to keep moving, and beaten or worse for failing to meet impossible quotas. In some of the worst camps, the death rate among the least prisoners in a single year reached levels that would have wiped out the entire population in a few seasons, and when one man died, the authorities simply arrested another to replace him, because the supply seemed endless, and the laws designed to generate it never stopped working. The genius and the evil of the system was that it made the brutality profitable for everyone except the people enduring it, which is precisely the kind of arrangement that tends to survive far longer than it should, since there is always someone counting the money and very few people counting the graves. The names of some companies that grew wealthy on this labour are still familiar today, their origins in the leasing camps tactfully omitted from the corporate histories. While one part of the system was busy re-enslaving people through the back door of the criminal law, another part was pursuing a different kind of control over the bodies of those it deemed undesirable, through a pseudoscience that was for a few decades treated as the height of progressive thinking. The idea was that the human race could be improved by preventing supposedly inferior people from reproducing, and that the state had both the right and the duty to do the preventing, with a scalpel if necessary. Under laws passed across many states, tens of thousands of people, more than 60,000 over the course of the program, were forcibly sterilized without meaningful consent. The targets were the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, the incarcerated, and people simply judged to be feeble-minded, a wonderfully elastic category that in practice often meant little more than being poor, female, and inconvenient. The whole enterprise received its official blessing from the very top, when the highest court in the land considered the case of a young woman who had been institutionalized and slated for sterilization. Her case had been deliberately chosen and shepherded as a test, a clean vehicle to get the court to bless the practice, and the proceedings were something close to a charade, with her own lawyer reportedly mounting a feeble defense and colluding more with the other side than with his client. She had been committed in part because she had a child that, it was later established, was the result of an assault by a relative of the family she had been placed with, which made her not some hereditary menace but a young woman punished for being a victim. The court ruled against her, and one of its most revered justices wrote the decision, concluding with the chillingly casual judgment that 3 generations of so-called imbeciles were quite enough, as though he were declining a third helping at dinner rather than authorizing the permanent violation of a human being. The supposed third generation, her infant daughter, was a perfectly ordinary child who did well in school in the brief time before she died young, which rather demolished the hereditary theory the entire case had been built to defend, though by then the ruling was law and the scalpels were already busy. That ruling stood for decades and gave cover to a great deal of suffering, and the young woman at the centre of it later emerged, had not been feeble-minded at all, merely poor and unlucky and caught in a system eager to find someone to make an example of. What is often forgotten is just how respectable and mainstream this thinking was at the time. This was not a fringe obsession of cranks. It was taught in universities, funded by wealthy philanthropists, promoted at world fairs with cheerful exhibits, and embraced by many of the era's most prominent reformers and scientists who genuinely believed they were helping to build a healthier future by editing the human stock. There were even contests at agricultural fairs that judged families the way one might judge prize livestock, awarding ribbons to those deemed to have the best hereditary qualities, which is exactly as unsettling as it sounds. The darkest legacy of this homegrown movement is that it did not stay home. Its laws, its arguments, and its pseudo-scientific framework were studied and admired abroad, and they helped provide the intellectual scaffolding for the racial purity programs of a regime that would soon become the country's mortal enemy, a regime whose own sterilization and worse policies were explicitly modelled in part on the laws already on the books across the ocean. So the country found itself in the deeply awkward position of having pioneered ideas that its greatest foe then took to their monstrous conclusion, after which the whole enterprise quietly fell out of fashion at home, though the laws lingered and the sterilizations continued in some places for decades more, just with rather less bragging about it. The most concentrated version of this campaign unfolded not on the mainland at all, but on an island territory, where over the middle decades of the 20th century a sweeping sterilization drive was carried out among the local women, encouraged by officials and framed as a solution to poverty and overpopulation. The procedure became so common, so routine, and so casually promoted that it was known among the women simply as the operation, performed so widely that by the mid-1960s roughly a third of women of childbearing age on the island had been sterilised, one of the highest rates anywhere in the world. Many of these women were never properly told that the procedure was permanent, believing it could be reversed, only to discover later that the decision had been made for them forever. It was population control aimed at a specific people, conducted with the bland confidence of administrators who had decided that fewer of a certain kind of person being born was a public good worth engineering, and who did not feel any particular need to make sure the women understood what was being done to them. The procedure spread so thoroughly partly because it was made dramatically more accessible than almost any other form of care. In some places it was offered for free or at minimal cost, performed conveniently right after childbirth while a woman was already in the hospital, and promoted by health workers and employers alike as the modern, responsible thing to do, sometimes presented as a simple and routine choice rather than the irreversible step it was. Factories were even said to favour hiring women who had already undergone it, turning what was supposed to be a personal medical decision into something close to an economic requirement. Layered on top of that was the island's long use as a testing ground for early forms of the contraceptive pill, with local women serving as trial subjects for doses and formulations that would later be refined for use elsewhere, not always with full understanding of the risks they were accepting. Taken together, it amounted to treating the women of an entire territory as a convenient laboratory and a population to be managed, their fertility regarded as a public problem to be solved rather than a private matter belonging to them, all carried out with the smiling efficiency of people certain they were doing good. The willingness to treat an entire group of citizens as a problem to be managed rather than people with rights showed up again, in spectacular fashion, in the response to a wartime panic. After the country was drawn into a global conflict, suspicion fell on citizens and residents who shared ancestry with one of the enemy nations. Despite the overwhelming majority of them being loyal, ordinary people, many of them born in the country and knowing no other home. An executive order authorized the military to designate zones from which these people could be excluded, and what followed was the rounding up of around 120,000 men, women and children who were given days to dispose of their homes, businesses and possessions before being shipped off to hastily built camps in remote and desolate places, ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. They had been charged with no crime. There was no evidence of disloyalty. Their only offence was their ancestry, and for that they spent years behind wire, losing farms, shops and savings that had taken lifetimes to build. It is worth noting that residents who shared ancestry with the other enemy nations, against whom the country was equally at war, faced no such mass roundup, which made it fairly clear that the policy had less to do with genuine security than with which group looked sufficiently different to be feared. The highest court, continuing its proud tradition of blessing the indefensible, upheld the whole thing as a legitimate wartime measure. It took until the late 1980s, more than 4 decades later, for the government to formally apologise and provide a modest payment to the survivors, by which time many of the people who'd been imprisoned were gone, the apology arriving, as these things do, mostly in time for the funerals rather than the lives. The bitterest irony of the whole episode is that even as their families sat behind barbed wire, many young men from those very communities volunteered to fight for the country that had imprisoned their parents, forming a segregated unit that went on to become one of the most decorated in the entire war, suffering staggering casualties in fierce combat, while their relatives remained locked in camps back home. They were quite literally bleeding for a nation that did not trust their grandmothers to live freely in a coastal town. The conditions in the camps themselves were bleak, with families crammed into tar paper barracks in scorching deserts or freezing high plains, sharing communal latrines, eating in mess halls, and trying to maintain some shred of normal life, opening schools and planting gardens in places specifically chosen for being as desolate and far from anywhere as possible. The economic devastation outlasted the imprisonment by generations, because the farms, homes and businesses sold off in a panic at fire sale prices were gone for good, and the modest payment that finally came decades later did not begin to cover what had been stripped away. Decades after the fact, the highest court itself would acknowledge that its original decision blessing the internment had been gravely and shamefully wrong, a rare admission that arrived, naturally, far too late to free anyone. The pattern of meeting citizens with overwhelming force when they became inconvenient was not limited to any one group either. In the depths of the great economic collapse, a large gathering of military veterans descended on the capital, camping in makeshift shelters to demand the early payment of a bonus they had been promised for their wartime service money they desperately needed as the economy crumbled around them. These were not radicals or criminals. They were former soldiers, many with their wives and children, asking their government to honour a promise during a time of genuine desperation. The response was to send in the regular army. A famous general, who would go on to even greater fame in the next war, personally led the operation, and troops with bayonets, tanks and tear gas advanced on the camp of unarmed veterans and their families, driving them out and burning their shelters to the ground. The sight of the country's own soldiers attacking the very veterans who had fought for it shocked the public, though it did not stop the general, who appears to have genuinely believed he was putting down a dangerous insurrection, rather than dispersing a crowd of hungry men holding up signs. The general had actually been ordered to clear the protesters from a particular area and no further, but he decided on his own initiative to press the attack across the river and into the main encampment where the families were living, exceeding his instructions in the apparent conviction that he was saving the Republic from revolution. The camp was put to the torch, and in the chaos there were deaths, including, by some accounts, a small child who succumbed to the effects of the gas. The image of decorated veterans, men who had been celebrated as heroes barely a decade earlier, being routed by tanks and cavalry and tear gas at the hands of their own army, on the orders of a future war hero, did lasting damage to the administration that allowed it, and became a symbol of how quickly a government could turn its instruments of war against the very citizens those instruments were meant to protect. The veterans had asked only for money they were owed. They received a cavalry charge instead, which is a rather emphatic way of saying the check is not in the mail. Sometimes the violence was not the state acting directly, but the state standing aside while a community destroyed its own, which brings us to one of the most thoroughly buried atrocities in the country's history. In a thriving district of one city, the local black population had built an extraordinary enclave of prosperity, a neighbourhood so full of successful businesses, banks, theatres and fine homes that it earned a nickname celebrating its wealth. This was, to many of the white residents of the surrounding city, an intolerable affront, a living refutation of everything they wanted to believe. After an incident involving a young black man and a young white woman in an elevator, an incident that was almost certainly trivial and possibly entirely innocent, a white mob gathered, rumours flew, and the neighbourhood was attacked. Over roughly a day, the prosperous district was looted, burned and levelled, with hundreds of people likely killed, thousands left homeless, and the entire accumulated wealth of a community reduced to ash. In a detail that sounds almost too cruel to be real, aircraft were reportedly used during the assault, flying over the neighbourhood, making it one of the only times an American city was attacked from the air by its own people, with the apparent cooperation or at least inaction of local authorities. Afterward, there were no real consequences for the attackers, no meaningful compensation for the survivors, and a decades-long silence so complete that many people in the same city grew up never having heard of it at all. The whole catastrophe quietly erased from the local memory as though a thriving neighbourhood and its people had simply never existed. The suppression of the aftermath was almost as deliberate as the violence itself. Insurance companies refused to pay out on the destroyed properties by classifying the event as a riot, a category conveniently excluded from coverage, which meant the families who had lost everything could not even collect on the policies they had faithfully paid into. When the survivors tried to rebuild, the local authorities responded by passing new ordinances designed to make rebuilding prohibitively difficult, a final insult that suggested the goal had never been merely to punish the neighbourhood but to ensure it never rose again. Newspaper accounts went missing, official records vanished, and the event was kept out of the history books for so long that it became a kind of open secret, known to the families who had survived it and almost no one else. Only in recent years have researchers begun searching for the unmarked mass graves where the victims are believed to have been hastily buried, using ground-penetrating radar to look for the dead that the city spent a century pretending it did not have, a grim, archaeological reckoning with a crime that powerful people had hoped would simply dissolve into forgetting. That same era produced an episode that goes a step further still, because it was not merely a massacre, but an actual armed overthrow of a legitimately elected local government, the only successful coup of its kind on American soil. In a port city, an elected, racially integrated local government had taken power through ordinary democratic means, which a faction of the white establishment found unacceptable. The city had been, by the standards of its time and place, a genuine success story of multiracial cooperation, with black professionals, business owners, and office holders working alongside white ones, exactly the kind of arrangement that some powerful people were determined to prove could not be allowed to last. Rather than wait for the next election, they organised an armed uprising, marched through the city, attacked the black community, killed an unknown number of people, and forced the elected officials to resign at gunpoint, installing their own men in their place. It was, by any honest definition, a violent coup that erased the results of a free election, and yet for generations it was politely described in local histories as a mere riot or disturbance, a softening of language that conveniently obscured the fact that a duly elected government had been overthrown by force, and the perpetrators had simply kept the power they seized. The campaign behind it had been planned in advance and openly, with leading figures of the white establishment giving fiery speeches in the days beforehand, and a prominent newspaper publishing inflammatory material designed to whip up fury. On the appointed day, a heavily armed mob numbering in the hundreds marched on the offices of a black-owned newspaper, burned it to the ground, and then moved through the streets shooting people, while the targeted residents fled into the surrounding swamps and woods to escape. Once the violence had done its work, the conspirators forced the existing officials to step down one by one and installed themselves, completing the takeover before the day was out. In the aftermath, thousands of black residents, including many of the city's most prosperous and educated citizens, simply left, abandoning homes and businesses and transforming the entire character of a place that had been one of the more integrated and economically promising cities in the region. The coup succeeded so completely that it became a model others studied, and its true nature was buried under euphemism for the better part of a century, until historians finally went back and called it what it had always been: the forcible overthrow of an elected government on home soil. All of these threads, the unpaid debt of slavery, the leasing of prisoners, the forced sterilizations, the camps, the assaults on veterans and on entire communities, feed into a single modern fact that ties the historical injustice to the present day. The country now imprisons its people at a rate higher than any other nation on earth, holding a share of the world's prisoners wildly out of proportion to its share of the world's population, with the total number of people behind bars swelling enormously over the past several decades. A great deal of that growth flowed from the very drug policies we discussed earlier, the harsh sentencing that swept up vast numbers of people, and it falls, as so much of this history does, disproportionately on the descendants of the people who were enslaved, then leased, then policed, then locked up. The loophole that allowed forced labour as punishment for a crime still sits in the founding legal text, and in some places incarcerated people still work for pennies an hour or nothing at all, which means the thread connecting the plantation to the prison has never actually been cut, merely renamed a few times along the way. The scale of the modern system is genuinely staggering when you sit with the numbers. A country that holds only a small fraction of all the people alive on the planet somehow manages to hold roughly a quarter of everyone imprisoned anywhere, a wildly disproportionate share that no other developed nation comes close to matching. The total population behind bars climbed by several 100% over the span of a few decades, driven not by a comparable explosion in crime but by deliberate choices about policing, sentencing, and which behaviours to treat as serious offences. Incarcerated workers today produce goods and services worth a great deal, fighting fires, manufacturing furniture, staffing call centres and working fields, often for wages that would be illegal anywhere else, and in a few places for no pay at all. When you line up the criminalisation of newly freed people, the leasing of their bodies to private industry, and the modern reliance on cheap or unpaid prison labour concentrated heavily among the same population, the continuity is impossible to ignore. It is not that the country built a prison system that happens to resemble the old order by unhappy coincidence. It is that the same logic of extracting labour from a controlled and disposable population kept finding new legal clothes to wear, each one respectable enough for its era, each one quietly doing a version of the old job. What makes this chapter distinct from the secret programs is precisely that none of it was secret. The sterilisation laws were published, the internment was announced, the leasing was legal, the court rulings were celebrated as wise, the coup was reported, however dishonestly. This was not a conspiracy hidden from the public so much as a consensus the public largely accepted, which is in some ways more disturbing, because it means the harm did not depend on a few villains in a back room, but on the comfortable agreement of a great many ordinary people that certain other people simply did not count for as much. The covert operations elsewhere in this story at least had the decency to know they needed hiding. The injustices at home were frequently done with the lights on, the doors open, and the full expectation of applause, which raises an uncomfortable question that no classified stamp can answer, namely what a society is willing to do to its own when it has decided, out loud and on the record, that some of its members are worth less than others. The secret programs could always be excused, when exposed, as the work of a few rogue actors who had strayed from the nation's true values. The open injustices allow no such comfort, because they were the values, or close enough to them, endorsed by courts, codified by legislatures, and accepted by majorities who saw nothing remarkable in any of it. That is the harder thing to sit with as the lights stay low tonight. Not that a handful of officials did terrible things in the dark, but that a great many ordinary people watched terrible things happen in the daylight and decided they could live with it, which is perhaps the most human and least comfortable fact in this entire account. It would be comforting to think all of this belongs safely to the past, that the camps and the secret sprayings and the engineered coups were the products of a less enlightened age that we have since outgrown. But the same instincts, the secrecy, the willingness to harm in the name of safety, the burying of inconvenient truth, carried right on into the present century, often with better technology and worse lawyers. The era that opened with a catastrophic attack on home soil produced a fresh crop of the very behaviours this whole account has been tracing, and because it is recent, the wounds are still fresh, and the files, in many cases, still sealed. In the panic that followed the attacks, the intelligence service built a global archipelago of secret prisons, scattered across cooperative countries far from any courtroom or camera, where suspects could be held and interrogated entirely outside the reach of the law. The locations were chosen with care, in nations willing to host such facilities quietly in exchange for various favours, the logic being that if you conduct your interrogations on foreign soil, in a legal grey zone of your own design, then the protections that would apply at home simply never come into play. Suspects were flown between these sites on unmarked aircraft operated through a web of front companies, a practice that hid the movement of human beings behind the dull paperwork of ordinary charter flights, and some of those swept up in this net turned out, after months or years of harsh confinement, to have been cases of mistaken identity, ordinary people grabbed on bad information and then held precisely because releasing them would mean admitting the mistake. The methods used in these places were, by the agency's own later descriptions, brutal. Detainees were subjected to a technique that simulated drowning, strapped down while water was poured over a cloth covering their face until their body believed it was dying, a process that one prisoner endured an astonishing number of times, well over 80 separate sessions, which rather undercuts the official claim that it was a precise tool used only when strictly necessary. If a method needs to be applied more than 80 times to one man, it is reasonable to suspect it is not working as advertised. Prisoners were kept awake for days on end, in some cases for over a week straight, chained in painful positions, slammed into walls, locked in coffin-sized boxes, and subjected to a menu of other torments dressed up in the bland language of enhanced techniques, a phrase doing the heaviest lifting in the entire war on terror. At least one detainee died in custody, left chained and half-naked in the freezing cold of a secret facility until his body simply gave out. Perhaps the most surreal detail of the whole program is who designed it. The interrogation regime was not built by seasoned experts with deep knowledge of how to extract reliable information. It was largely devised by a pair of outside psychologists who had never actually conducted a real interrogation between them, and whose main qualification was having helped run a training program that taught the country's own soldiers to resist torture if captured. They essentially took that resistance training, flipped it around, and sold it back to the government as an interrogation method, for which their company was reportedly paid a sum running into the tens of millions of dollars. So a technique meant to help people survive torture was reverse engineered into a technique for inflicting it, by consultants charging premium rates, which is the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that you have to admire even as it horrifies you. To compound the secrecy, when investigators later went looking for the recordings the agency had made of some of these interrogations, they found that the tapes had been deliberately destroyed, shredded out of existence by officials who understood perfectly well that footage of what had been done would be far harder to explain away than a carefully worded memo. As we saw with the mind control files burned decades earlier, the destruction of evidence is itself a kind of confession, the act of a person who knows exactly how the truth would look if anyone ever saw it. After years of investigation, a committee of the Senate produced an enormous report, thousands upon thousands of pages, that examined the program in detail and reached two devastating conclusions. The first was that the interrogations had been far more brutal than the public had ever been told. The second, and arguably more damning, was that all this cruelty had been essentially useless, producing little or no unique intelligence that could not have been obtained through ordinary means, and in many cases producing fabricated information as desperate detainees said whatever they thought might make the pain stop. So the program failed on both the moral count and the practical one, managing to be both monstrous and pointless, which is a rare and unimpressive achievement. And yet, despite a detailed official record confirming that people had been tortured, no one who designed, approved, or carried out the program faced any criminal consequences. The full report itself remains largely classified, with only a summary released to the public, the bulk of it locked away on the grounds that the truth might be embarrassing or dangerous, which are, of course, two words that often mean the same thing. The fight over even that summary was its own revealing drama. The agency whose conduct was under examination was, remarkably, given the job of helping to vet what could be released, a bit like asking the defendant to edit the prosecutor's closing argument. There were bitter disputes over redactions, accusations that the agency had improperly accessed the investigators' own computers during the inquiry, and years of delay before a heavily blacked-out summary finally reached the public. The committee chair who pushed it through faced enormous resistance, and the moment a friendlier administration took over, copies of the full classified report were reportedly recalled and tucked away, raising the very real prospect that it could eventually be locked up or even destroyed before it is ever fully seen. So the most thorough official accounting of a torture program runs the risk of meeting the same fate as so many records before it, surviving as a fragment while the complete truth sits sealed in a vault, waiting on some future deadline that may or may not ever arrive. The pattern is by now so familiar it is almost a ritual, the truth partially admitted, the full version withheld, and the promise that someday, when it can no longer hurt anyone important, the rest will come out. The same period produced a domestic mystery that ruined lives and was never satisfyingly solved. Shortly after the attacks, letters laced with deadly anthrax spores began arriving at the offices of news organizations and lawmakers, killing several people and terrifying a nation already on edge. The investigation that followed was a long and clumsy affair. For years, suspicion fell publicly on one scientist, whose name was effectively leaked to the press, and who found himself hounded, surveilled, and named as a person of interest in connection with the attacks, his career and reputation destroyed in the process. He was never charged, because as it turned out he had nothing to do with it, and he eventually won a substantial settlement from the government for the way he had been treated, several $1 million that did not give him back the years of being treated as a presumed bioterrorist. The investigation then shifted to a different scientist who worked at a government biodefense lab, the very kind of facility that handled the deadly material in question. Before that case could ever be tested in a courtroom, where his guilt or innocence might have been properly established, he died, with his death ruled a result of his own actions amid the mounting pressure. The government promptly declared the case effectively closed and pinned it on him, even though significant doubts about the strength of the evidence lingered and a trial never happened. So the official story is that the culprit was a lone, troubled scientist who took his own life before he could be brought to justice, a conclusion that is convenient precisely because the only person who could contest it is no longer around to do so. The deeper problem is that the scientific case against him was a good deal shakier than the confident official announcement suggested. The evidence was largely circumstantial, built on the claim that the specific strain of the deadly material traced back to a flask under his control, but that same material had been shared with a number of other labs and researchers over the years, meaning a great many people had potential access to it. Independent reviews later raised pointed doubts about whether the science actually proved what the investigators said it proved, noting gaps in the chain of reasoning that a defense attorney would have torn into had the case ever reached a courtroom. But it never did reach a courtroom, which is exactly the point. By declaring the case solved and the suspect dead, the authorities got to skip the inconvenient step where their evidence would have been tested by someone whose job was to find its weaknesses. It is a great deal easier to win an argument when the other side is not allowed to show up, and easier still when the other side is no longer alive. The earlier scientist, whose life had been wrecked by years of public suspicion, at least lived to collect his settlement and clear his name, a small mercy denied to the man the case was ultimately hung on. That same world of dangerous pathogens and secretive laboratories sits at the centre of a more recent and bitterly contested question, one that remains genuinely unresolved as of this telling. For years, research funding had flowed into studies that involved deliberately enhancing certain viruses to make them more transmissible or more dangerous. A field of work pursued under the reasoning that understanding how a virus might become more threatening could help us prepare for it, but which critics warned was essentially manufacturing the very pandemic risk it claimed to study. When a devastating global pandemic later emerged, a fierce and ongoing debate broke out over where it had actually come from, with one camp favouring a natural spillover from animals and another raising the possibility of a connection to laboratory research, and a great deal of secrecy and defensiveness on multiple sides, making the truth maddeningly hard to pin down. It is important to be honest here about the limits of what is known, because this is a question still genuinely open to investigation rather than a settled fact. What is not in dispute is that the reflexive secrecy, the reluctance to share data, and the early efforts by some officials to shut down certain lines of inquiry as unthinkable did enormous damage to public trust, regardless of where the virus ultimately came from. When institutions respond to a reasonable question by trying to make the question itself disreputable, they teach the public to assume the worst, which is a lesson this entire history has been hammering home from the very first chapter. It is worth dwelling on this dynamic, because it is the engine that turns ordinary uncertainty into corrosive distrust. A genuinely open question, honestly acknowledged, is something a thoughtful public can sit with. People understand that science is hard, that origins can be murky, that the truth sometimes takes years to establish. What people cannot abide, and what this history teaches them to expect, is the sense that they are being managed, that certain explanations are being ruled out of bounds not because they have been disproven, but because they are inconvenient to powerful interests. When some of the same scientists whose work might be implicated in a question are also among the loudest voices declaring that question settled, the public does the arithmetic and grows suspicious, whether or not that suspicion is fair in any given instance. The tragedy is that this dynamic poisons even the honest experts, because once trust has been burned often enough by the cases in this account, people stop being able to tell the difference between a sincere reassurance and another comforting cover story. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a children's tale, but it describes the predicament of modern institutions with uncomfortable accuracy. After enough confirmed deceptions, even the true statements struggle to be believed, and that erosion of trust may turn out to be one of the most lasting costs of the whole long pattern, harder to repair than any single program it produced. The instinct to keep things sealed long past any reasonable justification is perhaps the most enduring theme of all, and it shows up in documents that have been locked away for absurd lengths of time. For more than a decade after the attacks, a section of an official investigation, running to roughly 24 pages, was kept classified, and the rumour mill insisted it contained explosive material about possible foreign government links to some of the attackers. When the pages were finally released, they revealed troubling questions about the support certain attackers may have received from individuals connected to a foreign government that was, awkwardly, a close ally, which goes some way toward explaining why the pages had been kept in a vault rather than shared with the public they concerned. And in a case that has now passed well beyond living memory for most people, files relating to one of the most studied political assassinations in the country's history remain, even now, not fully released, with successive promises to open everything followed by quiet decisions to keep portions sealed, citing vague concerns about sources and methods involving people who have been dead for half a century. At a certain point, the continued secrecy stops being about protecting anything and starts being about the simple, institutional habit of never admitting more than you have to. The assassination files are a particularly fine illustration of how secrecy outlives any conceivable reason for it. A law passed decades ago promised that all the remaining records would be made public by a specific deadline, on the sensible theory that whatever sources and methods might have needed protecting in the immediate aftermath could hardly still be sensitive after the better part of a century. The deadline came, and then it was quietly pushed back. Another deadline was set, and most of the files came out, but some were held, with promises that the rest would follow soon kept stretching. Each administration that inherited the matter found reasons to keep a portion sealed a little longer, which has done nothing whatsoever to calm the suspicions of a public that has spent generations wondering what could possibly still need hiding about an event everyone over a certain age remembers. The most likely truth is almost certainly less thrilling than the wildest theories, probably amounting to bureaucratic embarrassment about what the agencies knew, or failed to know, or failed to share with each other beforehand. But by guarding even the dull secrets as if they were explosive, the institutions guarantee that everyone assumes the secrets are explosive, which is a self-inflicted wound they seem incapable of stopping themselves from reopening every few years. The modern era also produced its share of incidents on the battlefield handled with the same old reflex to obscure rather than confront. In one war zone, an aircraft repeatedly bombed a hospital run by an international medical charity, striking it again and again over the course of a sustained assault, even as staff frantically called every contact they had to report that they were being hit, killing dozens of patients and medical workers, some of whom reportedly burned in their beds. The official explanation was a cascade of technical and human errors, a tragic mistake rather than anything deliberate, and while errors in war are real, the charity pointed out that it had provided the precise coordinates of the protected hospital to all parties well in advance, which makes the mistake a particularly hard one to wave away. No one faced serious criminal accountability, the matter resolved with disciplinary measures and condolence payments, the institutional preference being always to call such a thing an accident and move on rather than to examine too closely how an accident could go on for so long against a target everyone had been warned to avoid. The charity that ran the hospital was not content to let it rest there and demanded an independent international investigation into whether a war crime had occurred, a demand that went essentially nowhere, since such an inquiry would have required the cooperation of the very parties involved. Their argument was straightforward and hard to rebut. A protected medical facility whose coordinates were on file was struck repeatedly over a prolonged period, with the attack continuing even after frantic phone calls warned that a hospital was being hit, and the people inside included patients too sick to flee. If that did not warrant an independent examination, they asked, what possibly would? The official internal review concluded it was a combination of equipment failures, fatigue, and mistaken identification, a tragic chain of unfortunate events rather than a deliberate act, and disciplined a number of personnel administratively. The charity withdrew from the city, the hospital was gone, and a community that had relied on it for care was left without one, while the broader question of how such a thing is allowed to happen, and why it so reliably ends in an internal shrug rather than a courtroom, went unanswered, as it tends to. A smaller but emblematic case of the cover-up reflex involved a famous athlete who had walked away from a lucrative professional career to enlist after the attacks, becoming a celebrated symbol of patriotic sacrifice. When he was killed in action, his death was presented to the public and to his family as a heroic moment, cut down by enemy fire while leading his men. The truth, which the military knew almost immediately, was that he had been killed by his own side in a chaotic, friendly fire incident. Rather than tell his family the truth, the military constructed and promoted the heroic version, burned his uniform and gear, and kept the real story buried for weeks, while it milked the propaganda value of his sacrifice, only for the truth to come out and turn a story of inspiration into one of betrayal. His family, who had trusted the institution to be honest with them about how their son and brother died, spent years fighting to uncover what had really happened, discovering that the people who had handed them a folded flag had also handed them a lie. What made it worse was the machinery of honour that swung into motion around the false version. He was posthumously awarded medals citing the heroic enemy fire story that the people approving those medals had reason to know was untrue, and his death was deployed in speeches and ceremonies as a recruiting tool at a moment when the war effort badly needed inspiring stories. The family's anguish was compounded by the sense that their grief had been hijacked for a purpose, that the loss of a person they loved had been repackaged into a marketing campaign without their consent and against the truth. When they pushed for answers, they ran into the familiar wall of internal investigations that investigated little, of officials who could not quite remember key decisions, and of accountability that evaporated the higher up the chain it travelled. Several inquiries later, the broad outline of the cover-up was established, but as with so many of these cases, the consequences for those responsible were mild to non-existent, and the family was left with the truth they had fought for and very little justice to go with it. It is a small story next to the mass graves and the poisoned cities, but in some ways it captures the whole pattern in miniature, an institution that found it easier to construct a comforting lie than to simply tell a hard truth to the people who had every right to hear it. And this brings us, at the close of this long catalogue, to the single thread that runs through every chapter of it, the quiet and uncomfortable truth that ties the 18th century to the 21st. Almost none of what you have heard tonight came to light because an institution decided of its own accord to be honest. The plutonium injections, the city sprayings, the mind control files, the coups, the manufactured wars, the drug complicity, the torture, the buried massacres, the hidden deaths. Nearly every one of them stayed secret for as long as the people in charge could keep them secret, and saw daylight only because somewhere, somehow, a single individual decided that the rules protecting the secret mattered less than the truth the secret was hiding. The whole edifice of accountability in this story rests not on the goodness of institutions, but on the stubbornness of individuals who broke the rules. Think of the analyst who copied and released a massive secret study revealing that the government had known a certain war was unwinnable, even as it sent more young men to die in it, and who faced the full fury of prosecution for the crime of letting the public read the truth about a war fought in their name. He was put on trial facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, and the case against him only collapsed when it emerged that the government had been so determined to silence him that it had broken its own laws trying, which is a fitting little irony to keep in your pocket. Think of the soldier who passed an enormous trove of military and diplomatic records to the world, exposing among other things footage of civilians being killed, and who paid for it with years of harsh imprisonment. Think of the contractor who walked away from a comfortable life to reveal the staggering scope of modern mass surveillance, and who has lived in exile ever since, unable to return home. Think of the lonely officials and the persistent reporters who chipped away at stories everyone else had abandoned, the kind of people who keep a question alive long after the official answer has been filed and forgotten. Think of the biochemist from much earlier in our story, secretly dosed and dead beneath a hotel window, whose family spent decades clawing toward a truth the agency would have preferred to keep buried. Think of the reporter who exposed the drug connection and was destroyed by the very profession that should have protected him, vindicated only after his death. Different eras, different secrets, different prices paid, but the same essential act in every case, an individual conscience colliding with an institutional wall and choosing at enormous personal cost to tell. Consider what it actually takes to be that person. You are, almost by definition, an insider, someone who has been trusted with the secret precisely because the institution believed you would keep it. You have a career, colleagues, a salary, a comfortable place inside the machine. To speak is to throw all of that away in an instant, to become a traitor in the eyes of the people you worked beside, to face prosecution, ruin, exile, or worse, and to do it knowing that the institution you are challenging is vastly more powerful than you, and will very likely outlast and outspend you. The rational, self-interested move is almost always to stay quiet, to tell yourself it is not your problem, to let the secret remain a secret and keep your pension. Most people, faced with that choice, make the safe one, which is exactly why the secrets stay buried as long as they do. The whistleblower is the rare person who looks at that lopsided arithmetic and decides the truth is worth the wreckage anyway. They are not always saints, and their motives are not always pure, and reasonable people argue about whether particular leaks helped or harmed. But the simple fact remains that without these awkward, stubborn, often difficult individuals, we would know almost nothing, and the comfortable official version of events would be the only version that existed. And it is worth noting how badly the system tends to treat them, precisely as a warning to the next one. The punishments are frequently far harsher than anything handed to the officials who committed the underlying wrongs the whistleblower exposed, which sends an unmistakable message about what the institution actually considers the greater crime. Torturing prisoners, it turns out, carries less risk to your career than revealing that prisoners were tortured. Lying a nation into war is survivable. Leaking the documents that prove the lie is not. That inversion, where the messenger is punished more severely than the wrongdoer, is one of the clearest tells in this entire history, a flashing sign pointing at where the institutions place their true priorities, which is not on preventing the wrong, but on preventing the exposure. So the next time you hear something dismissed as a wild conspiracy theory, it is worth remembering that every single thing in this account was once exactly that. An unbelievable claim that the authorities denied, the press ignored, and the public found too outlandish to credit, right up until the paperwork proved it was true all along. That does not mean every wild theory is real, of course, since most of them genuinely are nonsense, and a healthy skepticism cuts in both directions. The same habit of mind that lets you catch a real cover-up will also, if you are honest with yourself, force you to discard a great many exciting stories that fall apart the moment you check them. And learning to tell the two apart is the whole skill. The difference almost always comes down to evidence rather than vibes. The events in this account are not believed because they are dramatic, or because they confirm anyone's suspicions. They are believed because there are documents, hearings, court records, settlements, and official admissions behind them. The unglamorous paper trail that separates established history from a thrilling story someone made up. A real conspiracy leaves receipts. The fake ones ask you to take them on faith and treat the absence of evidence as proof of how deep the cover-up goes, which is a tidy trick for never having to prove anything at all. But it does mean that the line between paranoid fantasy and undisclosed fact has been redrawn, again and again, by the patient arrival of documents that were never supposed to be seen. The lesson of all of it is not that you should trust no one and fear everything, which is its own kind of trap, but simply that you should keep asking, keep reading, and keep a little corner of your mind reserved for the possibility that the official story is not the whole story. The truth has a way of being slow, inconvenient, and late, but it also has a remarkable habit of refusing in the end to stay buried. And perhaps most of all, to remember the people who paid the price for the knowledge you now hold so casually, the ones who lost their careers, their freedom, and sometimes their lives so that a secret could become something you can look up in an afternoon. The least we can do, knowing what they sacrificed to tell us, is to actually listen. And with that, we reach the end of tonight's long walk through the things they hoped you would never find out. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. Now let your shoulders drop, let the day go, and let the quiet settle in around you. Good night to every one of you out there, wherever you're listening from, and may your dreams tonight be soft, peaceful, and entirely your own. Sweet dreams.